Hello everyone, I'm Mr. Lull from Scary Stories. I'm here to help you relax and drift off to a peaceful sleep. If you enjoy this, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, let's get started. I could never forget that night. It had etched into my memory like a scar on my mind. Chilling encounter that defies explanation. I was 13, maybe 14, old enough to be trusted with babysitting my younger siblings, but not old enough to feel invincible in the face of the unknown. Our house wasn't in some suburban neighborhood with streetlights and close-knit neighbors. No, it was nestled deep in the woods, surrounded by towering pines and undergrowth that swallowed the last light of day long before the sun dipped below the horizon. A place where shadows were long and silence carried weight. My parents had gone out for the evening, leaving me in charge. It was late autumn, and the crisp chill in the air seemed sharper that day. As the afternoon wore on, an unshakable sense of dread crept over me. It wasn't the usual unease of being home alone in a big creaky house. D was primal, a deep instinct screaming that something wasn't right. It was as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. By the time the sun began to sink, the feeling in my stomach had morphed into a knot of anxiety. Shadows stretched across the yard, merging into the dense forest beyond. I could ignore the sensation any longer. Driven by a mixture of paranoia and caution, I walked through the house, checking every door and window, ensuring each lock was secure. The rhythmic clicking of locks echoed in the stillness, amplifying the tension. After completing my sweep of the ground floor, I made my way upstairs to my sister's room. She had a large window that overlooked the backyard garden, sprawling patch of earth bordered by a wall of trees, so thick they seemed impenetrable. As I stood by the window, scanning the dimly lit yard, the first thing I noticed was the unnatural stillness. The trees barely swayed, and even the usual chirps and rustles of forest life were absent. Then I saw it. A dark figure, barely distinguishable against the shadows, was moving in the yard. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the figure was undeniably there, slinking around the side of the house. It wasn't a person, at least, not one moving like any person I'd ever seen. Its movements were fluid, almost predatory, as if it were stalking something. My breath caught in my throat, and my pulse thundered in my ears. Panic set in, but I knew I could have afforded to freeze. My siblings were asleep, and I was their only line of defense. Without thinking, I bolted to my parents' room and flung open the closet door. My dad and 12-gauge shotgun sat on the top shelf, loaded and ready for emergencies. My hands shook as I grabbed it, adrenaline turning my fear into shaky resolve. It could not have taken more than 30 seconds to retrieve the gun and rush back to my sister-in window. But when I looked down again, the figure was gone. The yard was empty, as if nothing had been there at all. I refused to believe it had just vanished. Something that moved like that could simply disappear. I sprinted through the house, my heart pounding as I checked every window, every door, scanning the perimeter for any sign of movement. But the creature, if that what it was nowhere to be seen. Frustration mingled with fear, and in a moment of youthful bravado, I threw open my sister window and yelled into the encroaching darkness. My voice echoed back, hollow and unanswered, swallowed by the oppressive silence. It was gone, but the weight of its presence lingered, heavy and suffocating. Then I noticed something even more unsettling: the dogs. Our 2 German shepherds were nowhere to be found. They were always nearby, their protective instincts keeping them close to us when we were home. But now the yard was eerily empty. I called their names, my voice tinged with desperation. The minutes dragged on, each one amplifying the sinking feeling in my gut. Finally, I heard the crunch of leaves and the snapping of twigs. The dogs emerged from the woods, their tongues lolling and chests heaving as though they'd been running for miles. Their fur was damp and speckled with dirt, and their eyes darted nervously toward the tree line. Whatever they'd you been chasing, or fleeing from, was long gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window with the shotgun across my lap, staring into the darkness, waiting for the figure to return. But the woods remained silent, and the shadows held their secrets. My parents came home hours later to find me wide-eyed and tense, unable to articulate what had happened without sounding insane. When I was 22, I landed a job in New York City. At the time, I was living in Jersey, and it was clear the daily commute would be impossible. Moving closer to the city became a necessity, but with limited funds, my options were slim. That's why, when I stumbled upon a Craigslist ad for an incredibly cheap bedroom in the Hell's Kitchen area, I jumped at the chance. It seemed like an opportunity too good to pass up. The next day, I made the trip to the city to view the apartment. The landlord greeted me at the door, a quiet, socially awkward man who seemed harmless enough. The apartment itself was modest, but it suited my needs perfectly. The catch: I do have a roommate. The landlord assured me that Bren, the roommate, was a quiet to himself type, which sounded ideal. He knocked on Bren's door, hoping to introduce us, but Bren didn't respond. He'd probably knock, the landlord offered casually. With that, the tour concluded, and I decided to take the room. I filled out the application, and by the next day the landlord called to say I was approved. A week later, I moved in. My dad helped me haul my belongings into the small room. Oddly, Bren never emerged during all the noise and activity. We heard faint movements behind his door, so we knew he was home, but he didn't bother to come out. It struck me as strange, but I brushed it off. Maybe he was just shy once my dad left. I was alone for the first time in my new place. I settled onto my bed, pulled out my laptop, and started watching Netflix. That mean when I heard it, the creak of a door opening and closing. Excited for a chance to finally meet Bren, I hopped out of bed and headed for the living room. But by the time I reached the doorway, the front door to the apartment slammed shut. Bren had already left. I stood there, puzzled. Surely, we do have to meet eventually, right? Shaking off the unease, I returned to my room, ate a quick bowl of ramen, and went to bed. Later that night, I was jolted awake by the sound of the front door closing again. Footsteps echoed on the creaky wooden floor, stopping just outside my bedroom door. My heart raced as I stared at the sliver of light under the door, where I could see the faint outline of feet. Why was Bren just standing there? My breath caught in my throat as I sat frozen, too afraid to say anything. Finally, the footsteps retreated, and I heard Brennan's door click shut. I lay awake, my mind racing. All night, I could hear faint thumping noises coming from his room. I could fathom what he was doing in there, but I was too scared to confront him. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I fell asleep. The next morning, Bren was already gone. Assuming he had left for work, I spent the day shopping for groceries and apartment essentials. When I returned, I dropped my bags on the couch and cooked dinner. Bren still had come back, so I watched Netflix on the couch for a while. Later, I realized Igu forgotten toothpaste and made a quick trip to the nearby 7. When I returned, something caught my eye. Bren's door was slightly ajar, and the light was on. This was it, my chance to finally meet him. I knocked softly twice, then pushed the door open. What I saw made my blood run cold. The room was completely empty, no furniture, no belongings, nothing except a single chair in the corner. It was the kind of chair you could see in a high school classroom. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood there, staring at the barren room. Who was Bren? Was he even real? Feeling a sudden wave of panic, I turned off the light, closed the door, and retreated to my room. I locked the door, sat on my bed, and tried to steady my breathing. My head throbbed as if my brain was trying to process too many thoughts at once. In my desperation, I decided to call the landlord. I dialed his number and pressed the phone to my ear. As the line rang, a loud, piercing sound echoed from my closet. My blood turned to ice. The ringing was coming from inside the closet. The phone rang twice before going to voicemail. That meant the landlord had declined the call. My heart dropped as I realized the horrifying implication. The landlord was inside my closet. I backed away from the closet door, my whole body trembling, instead of confronting whoever was in there. I bolted to the bathroom and locked the door behind me. With shaking hands, I called the police. The officers arrived quickly and searched the apartment. What they found confirmed my worst fears. The landlord was hiding under my bed. As the story unfolded, it became clear that this man was not even a landlord. He did own the apartment, and there had never been a roommate named Bren. Somehow, he had gained access to the apartment and orchestrated this entire charade. Though I tried to press charges, the legalities were murky. Given that there was no official lease, I was left with no choice but to pack up and move out the very next day. My dad helped me haul my belongings back home while I searched for a new place. The experience left me shaken. Looking back, the landlord had given off unsettlings from the start, but I never could have imagined the chilling events that would follow. It was supposed to be a weekend of fun. My sister and I were thrilled when our aunt invited us camping. Her friends joined as well. 4 adults, lively and humorous, always telling stories that made you laugh until your sides hurt. Along with them were 2 brothers around our age, John and his younger sibling. The campsite itself was secluded, nestled deep in a forest that seemed to breathe with an eerie life of its own. Trees loomed tall, their skeletal branches entwined like gnarled fingers, and the dense undergrowth whispered secrets whenever the wind passed through. It was the perfect setting for a night of ghost stories. After dinner, as the campfire crackled and the sky faded into a blanket of deep indigo, the storytelling began. We took turns weaving tales of haunted shacks and cursed cabins, stories that sent chills racing down our spines. But it was one particular story that stood out, unsettling yet oddly captivating. Big Cannibal Willie, our friend, started, lowering her voice to a hushed whisper. They say he was a madman locked up in an asylum, but the day he was supposed to swear himself to repentance, he snapped, took the life of a priest, and walked right out, still wearing those ceremonial white robes. Never got caught. They say he roams the woods to this day, searching for his next meal. We laughed nervously, exchanging uneasy glances. It was just a story, of course, an absurd one at that, but the way her words hung in the air, almost tangible, left a lingering unease in the back of my mind. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the trees as we set about gathering sticks for breakfast. The crisp, earthy scent of the forest was a sharp contrast to the smoky aroma of last night's fire. The group of us kids split up, scattering across the clearing in search of kindling. June, the oldest of the group, took the lead, walking ahead with the confident stride of someone who thought he was in charge. I followed close behind, keeping an eye on him while scanning the ground for dry sticks. My sister and John, younger brother, lagged behind, laughing at some private joke. At some point, my attention wavered. A cluster of vibrant red berries caught my eye, their glossy surface gleaming in the sunlight. They looked out of place in the muted greens and browns of the forest, and I could resist leaning in for a closer look. When I straightened, John was much farther ahead, his figure half obscured by the dense foliage. "Hey, wait up!" I called, quickening my pace. He didn't respond, but his movements were unmistakable, his tall frame pushing through the underbrush with a deliberate, almost impatient force. His white shirt billowed slightly as he walked, stark against the dark greens of the forest weight shirt. I froze mid-step, my brow furrowing. None of us were wearing white, John's clothes had been dark green and brown, typical camping gear. "John!" I called again, my voice sharper this time. The figure ahead did not stop. Instead, it moved faster, the sound of crunching leaves growing fainter as it pushed deeper into the woods. "What are you doing?" My sistery voice jolted me out of my daze. I turned to see her standing a few feet behind me, her expression a mix of confusion and annoyance. "We too far from camp. Come back." I opened my mouth to retort, but stopped short when I noticed John and his brother standing beside her. They were both staring at me, clearly waiting for an explanation. My heart skipped a beat if John was behind me. Who was ahead? A chill raced down my spine as I turned back toward the direction where the figure had been. But it was gone. There was no trace of movement, no flash of white against the trees. The forest ahead was eerily still, as if it had been holding its breath. The trees in this part of the woods weren't dense enough to hide a person. Thin and sparse, they provided little cover, yet the figure had vanished as if it had never been there. My mind raced, replaying the scene over and over, trying to make sense of what I had seen. The white shirt, the deliberate strides, the way it had ignored my calls. When I rejoined the group, I kept my thoughts to myself. It wasn't until we were back at camp, recounting our morning over a plate of scrambled eggs, that the topic of Big Willie came up again. One of the adults joked about it, their tone light and teasing, but the name sent a shiver down my spine. I thought about the story from the night before, about a man in white who stalked the woods, his presence both ghostly and menacing. And I could shake the feeling that for a brief moment, that morning, I had come far too close to encountering him. Till this day, I can still see the white shirt in my mind's eye, a stark flash of color against the muted palette of the forest. The memory lingers, vivid and unsettling, a reminder of an experience I'll never forget. I first came across the ad on Zillow for a shared apartment near the chicken farm where I worked. It wasn't glamorous, but it was convenient and already furnished, perfect for someone like me, living paycheck to paycheck. All I needed was to bring my clothes and a small dresser. The spare room even had a bed ready for me, saving me the hassle of hunting for furniture. The man renting the place was Ben, an old-timer in his 70s. Our arrangement was informal. No contract, just weekly cash payments. He was more like a live-in landlord, though he called himself my roommate. Ben had an old-fashioned demeanor, from the way he dressed to how he ran the house. Despite his quirks, the deal was too good to pass up, especially for someone who didn't come from wealth. It felt like I hit the jackpot that first night. I was exhausted from a grueling day at work. I dropped onto the bed and fell into a deep sleep, only to be startled awake by the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. The soft glow of the hallway light spilled into the room, framing a silhouette in the doorway. It was Ben, his gnarled hand gripping the doorknob. His voice, deep and gravelly, broke the silence. "Stay out of the base," he said, his eyes shadowed by the dim light. "I know you been down there." I sat up, confused and defensive. "I have," I said firmly, and it was the truth. Ben stared for a moment, then closed the door without another word. His footsteps retreated down the hall, followed by the sound of him descending the stairs. I sat there, my heart racing, replaying the strange encounter in my mind. What was he talking about? The next morning, I had the day off. I watched from the living room window as Ben drove off in his battered car, presumably heading to the store. Alone in the house, my curiosity about the basement door gnawed at me. I'd seen him go down there before, but had never ventured in myself. His cryptic warning the night before only made me more determined to take a look. The door to the basement was unremarkable, blending in with the rest of the house. My hand hesitated on the knob, but I turned it and pushed the door open. A wave of cool, stale air hit me as I peered into the darkness. I felt for a light switch and found it at the bottom of the stairs. With a flick, the room was illuminated. At first glance, the basement was ordinary, cluttered with old boxes, tools, and furniture. But in the far corner, partially obscured by shadows, was another door. Something about it felt off, as though it did belong. I approached the door cautiously, noting the thick rubber seal along the bottom. The smell hit me before I even turned the knob, a sickly, nauseating stench that made my stomach churn. It took effort to push the door open, the seal resisting as though it were trying to keep something in. What lay beyond froze me in place. The small, windowless room was a nightmare. The concrete floor was stained with something dark, and heavy black bags were stacked neatly in the corner. Their shape, long and lumpy, made my skin crawl. The smell was overpowering, a mix of decay and chemicals. Above a workbench in the corner, a camera was mounted, its lens aimed downward like a silent observer. My pulse thundered in my ears as I fumbled for my phone. I snapped a quick picture of the scene, my hands shaking so badly the image was likely blurred. My instinct screamed to get out, and I did hesitate. I bolted upstairs, the door creaking ominously as I shut it behind me. I rushed to my room, throwing my clothes into a garbage bag as panic bubbled in my chest. Then I heard it, unmistakable sound of the front door slamming shut. Ben was back. I froze, listening as his heavy footsteps moved through the house. The creak of the basement door followed, and I heard him stomp down the stairs. This was my chance. Grabbing my bag, I tiptoed to the front door, flung it open, and sprinted to my car. My heart was pounding as I started the engine and sped away, not daring to look back. I drove straight to my brother farm, a safe haven where I could finally breathe. Shaking, I showed him the picture. His face paled as he stared at the screen. "You're an idiot for not calling the cops right away," he said. He was right, and I wasted no more time. Dialing 9-1-1, I reported everything, urging them to investigate before Ben could clear out whatever was in that room. Hours later, a deputy showed up at my brother's place, asking for my statement and identification. They confirmed that Ben had been arrested and that evidence was being collected from his basement. They didn't share much, only saying that what they found was enough to keep him in custody. I didn't need the details. I could guess what those bags contained. College is supposed to be a time of new beginnings, a fresh chapter filled with opportunity and friendships. But when I stepped into my dorm room for the first time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I never imagined the experience would turn into a waking nightmare. My roommate John, or I'll call him that for anonymity, was already there when I arrived. He was seated on his bed, hunched over a laptop. The faint blue glow from the screen cast eerie shadows on his face. His pale skin seemed almost translucent, and his jet black hair hung limply over his glasses. When he turned to greet me, his voice was soft, almost too soft, with a faint, unsettling edge. "Tai," he said, offering a handshake. The handshake was limp, cold and clammy, like shaking hands with a fish. Something about his demeanor sent a ripple of discomfort through me. I brushed it off, telling myself I was being judgmental. But as I unpacked my belongings, I couldn't ignore the strange way his eyes darted toward me when he thought I wasn't looking, or how he immediately returned to his laptop as if I did not exist. I decided to escape the tension and meet other students on the floor. The vibe with them was different. Easy, lighthearted, and welcoming. I quickly found a few people I clicked with, but as I returned to the dorm later that evening, the atmosphere shifted. The room was silent, almost suffocatingly so. John was already in bed, the lights out by 10 p.m. "Good night," he mumbled as he turned his back to me. That first night, I stayed up scrolling through my phone, the faint patter of rain on the window filling the void. Jon's peculiar quietness unsettled me, but exhaustion eventually pulled me under. The next morning, things took a strange turn. I came back from breakfast with some friends to find my duffel bag moved. Not just shifted slightly, but noticeably rummaged through. My belongings weren't strewn about, but something felt off. See subtle wrongness I could put my finger on. "Did you go through my stuff?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. John had snapped up from his laptop, his expression shifting to one of startled indignation. "Why would I do that?" he snapped, his voice uncharacteristically sharp. I couldn't prove anything, so I let it drop, but unease settled in my chest like a stone. That night, I invited John to join me and some of the guys for a hangout. He declined, muttering something about needing to stay ahead on his work. Fine by me, I left, trying to shake the growing discomfort I felt around him. When I got back, John was asleep, so I thought. The storm outside had picked up, thunder rattling the windows, and lightning flashes illuminated the room. I lay in bed too tired to care about anything but the weight of my eyelids. Yet even as I drifted off, I noticed the flashes seemed oddly rhythmic, almost deliberate. I told myself it was the storm and let sleep take me. The next morning I woke up to find my backpack unzipped and moved from where I left it. This time, I did confront him. Instead, I decided to stay awake that night and figure out what was going on. The day was long, the rain relentless, and by evening, the dorm was drenched in a gloom that seemed to seep into every corner. I pretended to go to bed early, lying on my side with my back to John. Hours crawled by as I waited, my heart pounding with anticipation. Around 1 a.m., I heard the faint creak of bed springs. I cracked my eyes open, careful not to move. John was sitting upright in his bed, his phone in hand. The flashes weren't from the storm. They were from his camera. He was taking pictures of me. My breath hitched, but I forced myself to stay calm. I shifted slightly, pretending to wake. "What are you doing?" I asked groggily. June flinched, his phone disappearing under his blanket. I could sleep," he stammered. The lie was so obvious, it sent a shiver down my spine. The next day, I told some friends on the floor about the incident. They were horrified and urged me to request a room change immediately. I agreed, but before I left, I noticed John had left his laptop unattended, the screen slightly ajar. Curiosity gnawed at me until I gave in. What I found will haunt me forever. His desktop was a chaotic mess of folders, files, and images. Clicking through the images confirmed my worst fears. There were dozens of pictures of me, taken in my sleep, some with the flash glaring off my face, others eerily still, as if he'd been trying not to wake me. There were photos of the contents of my duffel bag and backpack, meticulously documented as though cataloging my life. My stomach churned as I recorded a video of the screen, then deleted every photo I could find, but the images were burned into my mind. Shutting the laptop, I left the room and went straight to the dorm office. I showed them the video and demanded a transfer. They agreed, promising to investigate. That final night in the room was the longest of my life. I did sleep, not even for a second. Every creak, every rustle of the rain outside set adrenaline coursing through me. Around 2 a.m. I heard John bed springs groan again. This time his movements were slow, deliberate. The sound of his bare feet hitting the floor sent a shiver up my spine. I lay frozen as the faintest whisper of movement drew closer. Then I heard it, to quiet exhale right above me. He was standing over my bed. I didn't dare move. The air felt thick with his presence, the weight of his gaze pressing down on me. My heart pounded so hard I was certain he could hear it. Seconds stretched into an eternity before I heard him retreat, the springs of his bed groaning once more. The moment daylight broke, I packed my things and left. My new roommate was everything John was, friendly, normal, and safe. But even now the thought of John lingers. Somewhere out there, he still has those pictures of me. And you'd never know what his intentions were, how close I came to finding out. Moving out of my childhood home felt like the start of a new chapter, but I never imagined how quickly that chapter would spiral into a nightmare. Kathy, a family friend of my dad'n, was subletting her 2-bedroom apartment. She offered me an incredible deal, affordable rent in a well-furnished place that was close to work. The only caveat was that each have to share the apartment with another tenant she'd have found, an older woman named Betty. Kathy explained that she was tight on money, and I sympathized. It seemed like an arrangement I could handle the day I moved in. Kathy introduced me to Betty. She was in her early 60s, with wispy gray hair, sharp cheekbones, and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Polite but distant, she greeted me with a simple, "Pol nice to meet you." I could shake the awkwardness of living with someone who could have been my grandmother. Still, I reasoned that we could probably keep to ourselves, and the apartment was already furnished, which saved me a lot of hassle. All I brought was my bed, my dresser, and a suitcase of belongings. At first, everything seemed fine. Betty spent most of her time in her room, and we exchanged only brief pleasantries in the mornings. But on the second night, the atmosphere shifted. I was curled up on the couch in the living room, the soft glow of the television casting flickering shadows on the walls. The apartment was quiet, save for the faint sound of the show I was watching. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something, movement in the hallway. Turning my head, I froze. Betty's face was peeking out from behind the wall at the end of the hallway. Her eyes were wide and fixed on me, unblinking. Her expression was blank, almost robotic, and she didn't say a word. Then she started muttering low, guttural sounds that I could make out. "Betty, are you okay?" I asked, my voice breaking the silence. She did not respond. Instead, she let out a soft groan and slowly disappeared back into the hallway. I sat there, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to process what had just happened. Grabbing my phone, I called Kathy immediately. She sounded groggy but listened as I recounted what I had seen. "That strain," she said hesitantly. "I've only known Betty for about a week. She seemed normal when I met her." Her words didn't comfort me. Something about Betty's behavior felt off, and I could shake the unease. The next morning I ran into Betty in the kitchen. She was humming softly as she scrambled eggs in a pan. I hesitated before speaking. "Good morn," I said cautiously. "How are you feeling? You seemed upset last night." She turned to me with a puzzled expression. "Last night? What are you talking about?" Her confusion seemed genuine, but it only deepened the pit in my stomach. I wanted to believe it was just a misunderstanding, but a part of me felt on edge. That night, as I lay in bed with my laptop, I tried to push the incident out of my mind. The room was dark except for the glow of my screen. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, but persistent. A slow, rhythmic tapping on my bedroom door. I paused my video and strained to listen. That, and when I heard it, the same low muttering I had heard the night before. My blood ran cold. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. I sat frozen in my bed, unsure of what to do. The door didn't have a lock, and the thought of Betty standing on the other side filled me with dread. The knocking continued for what felt like an eternity before it suddenly stopped. I heard her shuffling footsteps retreat down the hall. Lake didn't come easily that night. The real horror unfolded 2 nights later. I was jolted awake by a sound. Creak on the floor near my bed. My heart hammered as I opened my eyes. The room was pitch black, but I could sense someone standing there. I fumbled for my bedside lamp, and when the light flickered on, I saw her. Betty was standing at the foot of my bed, her gray hair disheveled, her eyes wide and vacant. In her hand, she clutched a large kitchen knife. The blade glinted in the lamplight, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. "Betty," I whispered. my voice trembling. She didn't respond. Instead, she let out a low, guttural groan, the sound sending chills down my spine. My mind raced as I pressed myself against the wall, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure she could hear it. "Betty, what are you doing?" I stammered. She took a step closer, her grip tightening on the knife. I screamed, a sound so raw and terrified it barely felt like my own. But instead of lunging at me, she just stood there swaying slightly, her groaning growing louder. Then, without warning, she turned and shuffled out of the room, the knife still in her hand. I leapt from the bed and shoved my dresser in front of the door, my hands shaking uncontrollably. For the rest of the night, I sat in the corner of the room clutching my phone, too terrified to close my eyes. When the first rays of sunlight seeped through the window, I called Kathy. She was horrified when I told her what had happened, but explained that evicting Betty would take months. "I think it best if you leave," she said, apologetic. Kathy came over later that day to confront Betty, who denied everything. She claimed she had no memory of the incidents. After doing some research, Kathy and I discovered that Betty likely suffered from sundowning syndrome, a condition linked to dementia that causes confusion, aggression, and strange behavior after dark. A few years ago, something happened that still sends chills down my spine whenever I think about it. It was a night I'd never forget, no matter how much I wish I could. I was 15 years old at the time, and my best friend, Ryan, had invited me to sleep over at his house. It was supposed to be a carefree night of scary movies and snacks, just two teenagers having fun, but the night turned into something far darker than either of us could have imagined. After hours of watching horror films, we were filled with the kind of nervous energy that makes you crave something daring, something dangerous. Ryan suggested we take a walk to the old block of houses near his neighborhood. The area was notorious. A group of decaying homes left abandoned for years, scheduled for demolition in just a couple of days. Everyone in town had heard rumors about the place. Some said it was haunted. Others claimed to hear strange noises at night. Ryan, being the thrill-seeker he was, thought it would be the perfect spot for a late-night adventure. I hesitated at first, but curiosity got the better of me. We grabbed a digital camera and headed out. The night air was crisp, and the streets were eerily quiet as we made our way toward the block. When we arrived, the sight before us was more unsettling than I'd imagined. The houses loomed like silent sentinels in the dark, their facades weathered and crumbling. The streetlights barely illuminated the area, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. A tall chain-link fence surrounded the block, adorned with faded "Ined do not enter" signs. Every house was tightly boarded up, the windows and doors sealed with thick wooden planks. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the cold breeze. Ryan assured me he knew a way in, but as we walked along the perimeter of the fence, it became clear that every possible entrance was locked up, tight, frustrated. We were about to leave when something caught my eye. One of the houses had a window on the upper floor that wasn't as securely boarded as the others. Through the gaps in the planks, we could see faint shapes inside the room, though the darkness made it impossible to make out any details. Ryan immediately perked up and suggested we take a photo. I felt a wave of unease as he pointed the camera toward the window. The flash went off, momentarily lighting up the room beyond the planks. In that brief moment, I thought I saw movement, just a flicker, like the shadow of someone shifting. My stomach tightened, but I convinced myself it was my imagination. We decided to head back before we pushed our luck any further. Back at Ryan's house, we huddled around his laptop, excited to see the pictures we'd taken. Most of them were unremarkable, shots of the boarded-up houses, the cracked pavement, and the fence. But then we got to the photo of the upper window. The moment it appeared on the screen, the air in the room seemed to drop several degrees. There, In the photo was the unmistakable figure of a woman. She stood in the shadows of the room, just behind the planks. Her skin was pale, almost glowing, and her long black hair fell in tangled strands over her shoulders. She wore a tattered brown raincoat that looked damp, as though she had been caught in an endless storm. But it was her face that truly terrified me. Her expression was one of unbearable sadness, her dark eyes hollow and fixed on something beyond our understanding. Either of us could speak. We had seen anyone in the window when we took the photo, and the house was completely sealed. It didn't make sense. I felt a cold sweat break out on my back as I stared at the screen, the woman gaze seeming to pierce right through me. Ryan, always the skeptic, suggested we go back to the house the next day to investigate. I did not want to, but I could let him go alone. The following afternoon, we returned to the old block in broad daylight. The houses looked even more dilapidated under the harsh light of the sun, their crumbling facades a grim reminder of their abandonment. When we reached the house with the window, my heart sank. The boards were still in place, nailed down as tightly as before. We inspected every door, every window, but there was no way anyone could have gotten inside. The entire structure was sealed like a tomb. Maybe it was a trick of the light, Ryan muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. I didn't reply. Deep down, I knew what we had seen wasn't a trick. That night, I lay awake in my own bed, unable to shake the image of the woman. Her sad, lifeless eyes haunted my thoughts, and I could help but wonder who she was, what she was. Was she the ghost of someone who had lived in that house long ago, or something far darker, drawn to the decay and despair of the abandoned block? Ryan and I never talked about that night again, but sometimes, when alone, I pull out the old digital camera and look at the photo. She's still there, frozen in that moment, staring out from the darkness of a house that no longer exists. Rita, a close friend of mine from Japan, once shared a harrowing story from his childhood. Even years later, the memory still clings to him like a shadow at the time. Rita was just an 11-year-old boy, brimming with youthful innocence. He was a bright, attractive child, which naturally drew attention, while most of it was harmless admiration. There was one individual whose fixation went far beyond what anyone could call normal. Her name was Ayano, 17 years old and living just down the road. Ayano was someone Rita only knew in passing. She was a quiet acquaintance, someone he hardly gave much thought to, until her behavior started to change in ways he could ignore. At first, it was subtle, almost imperceptible, but soon it grew into something much darker. Ayano began to follow him everywhere, whether it was in the real world or online. Her presence loomed over him. At first, it was unsettling, but still manageable. Occasional sightings of her on the same streets, or random friend requests online. Then, the messages started pouring in, dozens of them each day. They were filled with mundane well wishes, like a bise or most sleep well. It was strange, but nothing alarming enough for Rita to feel threatened. But it didn't stop there. The messages took a sinister turn. Ayano seemed to know things she could possibly know. She would text things like, "Be you should eat your lunch," on days when Rita had skipped his meal, or "I think your sister is home." Moments after his little sister began crying, how could she know these things? The realization sent chills down his spine. Fearful and overwhelmed, Rita decided to cut off all contact. He stopped using his phone and deleted his social media accounts, hoping to escape her grasp, but Ayano wasn't deterred. In fact, she seemed determined to find new ways to insert herself into his life. Rita's mother worked long hours and was rarely home, so he and his siblings were often left in the care of babysitters. One day, a new sitter arrived. To his shock, it was Ayano. She acted completely normal, caring for Rita and his siblings like any responsible babysitter. But she soon began to develop an unsettling closeness to his mother. Ayano was charming, helpful, and attentive, everything a busy parent could hope for in a sitter. Rita, however, was filled with unease. Then came the day that would change everything. At school, Ayano approached Rita with surprising news. She claimed that his mother had to leave the country for a week and had arranged for him to stay at her house. Rita was taken aback. His mother hadn't mentioned anything about leaving, but Ayano assured him it was true, explaining that she had already left that morning. Reluctantly, and unable to challenge what seemed like his mother's decision, Rita agreed. That evening, he went home with Ayano. Her house was eerily quiet, the absence of her parents raising a red flag in Rita's mind. Still, he tried to rationalize it. Maybe they were at work or out running errands. Ayano acted like everything was normal, even cheerful, but her behavior quickly shifted once they were alone. Ayano proposed they play games, childish, peculiar games. She insisted on playing casting herself as the wife and Rita as the husband. Other times it was cops and robbers, or even stranger challenges where she would blindfold him and leave him alone in a silent room, testing how long he could last before crying out. Days passed in a haze of fear and confusion. Rita felt trapped, but Ayano kept a tight grip on his movements. On the 5th day, Ayano left for her part-time job, locking the doors behind her. The windows were too high to climb from, leaving Rita stuck. Desperate for distraction, he turned on the television. As he mindlessly flipped through channels, a breaking news report caught his eye. It was about a missing child. His stomach dropped when he realized the missing child was him. Before he could process what he just seen, the television abruptly switched off. He froze, paralyzed by the sound of breathing behind him. Turning slowly, he saw Ayano standing there, remote in hand, her expression cold and unreadable. Panic surged through him. He tried to scream, but Ayano lunged toward him, wrapping him in a suffocating embrace. He thrashed and fought, his small frame managing to slip from her grasp. In a burst of adrenaline, he scrambled to a nearby window and flung it open. Leaning out, he screamed for help with every ounce of strength he had. His cries were answered by a couple passing by on the street. They immediately called the police. The next hour was a blur. Officers stormed the house, finding Rita locked in a bedroom, blindfolded, and his hands tied. Ayano was taken into custody, while Rita, shaken and sobbing, was reunited with his mother. She held him tightly, tears streaming down her face as she whispered apologies. What happened to Ayano after that remains a mystery. Being a minor at the time, Rita wasn't privy to the legal proceedings. All he remembers is seeing her being led away by the authorities, her face devoid of remorse. Not long after, Rita and his family moved to Australia, leaving the haunting memories behind. Though years have passed, the mere mention of Ayano's name is enough to send shivers down Rita's spine. Her obsession left scars that time has yet to heal, a chilling reminder of the shadows that once loomed over his life. 5 years ago, I lived in the heart of a bustling U.S. city, surrounded by the hum of activity that never quite died down. I've always been a night owl, finding solace in the quiet hours when the world seemed to pause. My roommate, the polar opposite, would retreat to bed early, leaving me to wrestle with boredom. To fill the time, I developed a habit of taking long, contemplative walks. For 4 years, this nocturnal routine was my refuge, a time to think, wander, and soak in the urban stillness. During those years, I never had reason to feel uneasy. The city, though notorious in some respects, felt surprisingly safe to me. I do joke with my roommate about how even the city's sketchiest corners seemed tame, their occupants polite, if not outright charming. But that sense of security was shattered in the span of a single haunting evening. It was a Wednesday, somewhere between 1 and 2 in the morning. The night was particularly still, even for a midweek lull. The streets were deserted, save for the occasional car humming in the distance. I was near a police-patrolled park far from my apartment, but the quiet felt serene rather than sinister as usual. The park was empty, the lamplight casting long shadows across the pavement. I decided to take a detour down a side street, intending to loop back toward my apartment. That when I first saw him. At the far end of the street, on my side of the sidewalk, a man was moving. No, not walking, but dancing. His silhouette was sharp against the glow of a street lamp, his movements peculiar and hypnotic. He performed a dance reminiscent of a waltz, punctuated by a forward stride after each sequence. It was strange, but oddly fluid, as though he were a puppet on invisible strings, controlled by a master with an unsettling sense of rhythm, met wraithly. I thought he was drunk, maybe stumbling home after a night out. I stepped closer to the road, giving him ample space to pass, but as he drew nearer, the strangeness of his movements became more apparent. He was tall and lanky, wearing an old, slightly ill-fitting suit. His steps were unnaturally graceful, almost as if he were gliding. Then I saw his face. His eyes were wide, too wide, staring upward at the sky with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. His head was tilted back slightly and his mouth was stretched into a grotesque grin, as if frozen in a permanent, exaggerated expression of delight. It wasn't the kind of smile you could see on someone having fun. No, this smile was wrong, unnatural, and it seemed to grow more unsettling the longer I looked. Unease settled in my stomach, and I decided to cross the street. I kept my eyes on him, unwilling to lose sight of his bizarre performance. As I reached the other side, I glanced back, expecting to see him continue his odd dance. Instead, he had stopped. He stood perfectly still, one foot on the edge of the road, parallel to me. He was facing me now, though his gaze was still locked on the sky, and that terrible smile remained etched on his face. I froze. The quiet street seemed to grow quieter still, the air thick with an unspoken tension. I forced myself to move, walking briskly down the sidewalk while keeping him in my peripheral vision. He did not follow, relieved. I turned my attention back to the path ahead, but when I glanced back again, he was gone. For a fleeting moment, I felt a rush of relief until I noticed him again. He had crossed the street and was now crouched low, his figure partially obscured by shadows. Though the distance made it hard to discern his features, I was certain he was staring at me. My heart pounded in my chest. I hadn't looked away for more than 10 seconds. How had he moved so quickly, so silently? My legs felt rooted to the ground as I stared at him, unable to process the surreal terror of the moment. Then he began moving again. This time his steps were exaggerated and cartoonish, as if he were sneaking up on me in some grotesque pantomime. Despite the absurdity of his movements, he was closing the distance fast, far faster than he should have been able to. Panic gripped me. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there frozen, yet my body refused to obey. He stopped again, mere car lengths away, his grin unwavering, his eyes fixed on the sky. Summoning all my courage, I found my voice and shouted, "What do you want?" The words came out as a shaky, pathetic whimper, rather than the commanding tone Eeg intended. If he heard the fear in my voice, he gave no indication. He simply stood there smiling, his presence oppressive in the silence of the night. Then he turned, slowly, deliberately. He resumed his strange dance walk, moving away from me. My relief was short-lived. As he neared the edge of my sight, I realized something horrifying. He wasn't dancing anymore. He had stopped retreating. Instead, he turned back toward me, and this time he ran. We beat, zibi. For the rest of the night, I sat in the corner of my room, every sound outside sending my heart into overdrive. I stayed in that city for another 6 months, but I never went out for another walk after dark. The memory of his face, the unyielding smile, the wild eyes haunted me. He didn't look drunk or high. He looked utterly and completely unhinged. A reminder that the most terrifying thing to encounter is someone who has abandoned all connection to Reese. To this day, I wonder who Vol.2 was, and why, out of all the empty streets in the city, he chose to dance down mine. We vive, 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 vidi, vive, vive, why be vive. In the mid-1980s, my mom, a hard-working cleaner in Australia, made a living tidying homes in suburban neighborhoods. Occasionally, her work took her to more remote locations, including the picturesque yet isolated wine regions. Her business thrived through a mix of word-of-mouth referrals and the strategic placement of business cards in local shops. One day, she received a phone call that would change everything. On the line was an older woman who sounded around 60. Her voice carried a peculiar mix of urgency and hesitation as she requested my mom to clean her farmhouse. The woman was particular, unusually so, and laid out an odd set of requirements. Normally, my mom insisted on meeting clients before taking on new work, but the woman refused, claiming she would be home. She said she'd leave the keys under the front doormat and offered to pay an amount far beyond what my mom typically earned. The substantial payment, combined with the lady at obvious affluence, convinced her to accept. That Monday morning, my mom set out early, navigating the long drive to the farmhouse. As she turned onto the gravel driveway, unease crept over her. The property was vast, surrounded by an expanse of fields that stretched to the horizon. The house stood alone, an old weathered structure with peeling paint and darkened windows that seemed to watch her approach. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of gravel under her tires. Finding the keys where the woman had promised, she entered and began cleaning. The interior was as aged as the exterior, creaking floorboards, a faint smell of dust, and an unsettling stillness that seemed to seep into her bones. She tried to focus on her work, brushing away the feeling that the house was holding its breath about an hour in. As she scrubbed the kitchen current, the sound of a door shutting snapped her out of her rhythm. The back door, a heavy, deliberate sound. Her chest tightened. The woman had assured her no one would be home. She froze, gripping the counter for support for what felt like minutes. She stood still, straining to hear any other sound. Nothing. The silence pressed down on her like a weight, but her mind raced with possibilities. Had someone entered? Was it just the wind? Her instincts screamed at her to leave, but she hesitated. 2 rooms remained, both bedrooms, and she did not want to leave the job incomplete. It was as if completing the task would reclaim some control over the situation. Taking a deep breath, she convinced herself the sound had been nothing more than a draft. She moved cautiously down the hallway, her steps echoing in the empty house. As she pushed open the door to the first bedroom, her heart skipped a beat. The bed was covered with black and white photographs. At first, she thought they might be family photos, perhaps belonging to the woman who had hired her. But as she stepped closer, her blood ran cold. The photos were of her. In each image, she recognized herself, tidying a living room, watering plants, or arriving at a cliented home. Some were taken at angles that suggested they were shot from behind bushes, through windows, or over fences. There were even pictures of her at their family home, a place she had thought of as her sanctuary. She felt exposed, violated, and deeply unsafe. The air in the room felt suffocating, as if the walls were closing in. She grabbed the house phone, her hands trembling, and dialed the police. Explaining the situation as best she could, she was advised to leave immediately. She sprinted down the hallway, her pulse pounding in her ears, and drove straight to the end of the long driveway to wait for the authorities. The police arrived and began their investigation. They interviewed the woman who owned the house, but she claimed to know nothing about the photos. She insisted that there had been a break-in and suggested the photographs had been planted to frame her. For weeks the investigation dragged on, but no definitive answers emerged. The woman's story remained inconsistent, but without further evidence, the police eventually stopped pursuing the case. The incident shook my mom to her core. For weeks, she felt as though unseen eyes followed her every move. She could take the feeling of vulnerability, and the house lingered in her dreams, its empty windows staring at her like dark, hollow eyes. For months later, we packed up and moved to a new town. My mom never took cleaning jobs in isolated areas again, and the shadows of that farmhouse stayed with her for years. Though time dulled the edges of her fear, the memory never left her, a reminder that sometimes the quietest places hide the darkest secrets. At 22, I had finally taken a significant step toward independence, moving into my first apartment. It was a modest one-bedroom space with whitewashed walls and creaky wooden floors, but it was mine. A year and a half ago, during the height of summer, I was still in the process of unpacking boxes and settling into my new home. What should have been an exciting chapter of my life soon spiraled into a chilling memory I would never forget. The door to my apartment was one of those automatic locking types, convenient, I thought at first, no risk of forgetting to secure it. On this particular evening, I decided to fetch my mail from the lobby, with my phone pressed to my ear. I chatted casually with my friend about mundane things as I made my way down the hallway, out the entrance, and to the mailboxes. The air was warm, the sun still casting a soft golden hue over the building. Mail in hand, I returned to my apartment, closing the door behind me with a familiar click. I dropped the stack of letters onto the bed and sat down, still engrossed in my conversation. I opened one envelope, then another, flipping through bills and promotions while absent-mindedly balancing the phone on my shoulder. Suddenly, the device slipped from my grasp, falling to the floor with a dull thud before sliding under the bed. Muttering to my friend that Ika dropped my phone, I got onto the floor, stretching out to retrieve it. My hand groped the dusty space under the bed, fingers brushing against the cool surface of the phone. That hand when I saw it at first. I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The dim space revealed the outline of something, or rather, someone. Lying there, mere inches from my face, was a man. He was curled on his side, his back turned toward me with his head angled awkwardly toward his chest. His body was eerily still, as though he were a lifeless mannequin. My heart froze, a lump forming in my throat as adrenaline surged through my veins. I wanted to scream. I needed to scream. But instinct told me that drawing attention to my discovery might provoke him. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of the situation. Who was this person? How had he gotten into my apartment? Most importantly, what did he want? Feigning calmness, I spoke into the phone, my voice steady, despite the storm brewing inside me. "Sorry, I dropped my phone," I said. "I'm just gonna take a quick shower and call you back." Rising slowly to my feet, I forced myself to walk casually to the bathroom. Each step felt like a gamble, my muscles taut as I resisted the urge to glance back. Once inside the bathroom, I locked the door with trembling hands and turned on the shower. The sound of rushing water filled the space, masking the frantic beating of my heart. Without hesitation, I climbed onto the narrow windowsill, pushed open the window, and squeezed through. The two-story drop felt impossibly high as I dangled precariously, but the fear coursing through me was stronger than my vertigo. I landed on the soft grass below, my knees buckling slightly on impact. Gasping for air, I grabbed my phone and called the police. My voice shook as I explained the situation, describing the intruder hiding in my bedroom. The dispatcher instructed me to move to a safe distance and keep an eye on the building, noting if anyone exited. I positioned myself behind a parked car across the street, the warm asphalt radiating heat against my legs as I crouched low. From my vantage point, I could see my open bathroom window and the apartment complex entrance. The fading sunlight cast long shadows across the scene, heightening the tension. Minutes felt like hours. My friend arrived shortly before the police, his face pale with concern. Together, we watched as two officers entered the building with my keys. Time seemed to freeze, every second marked by the relentless pounding of my heart. Then they emerged. Between the officers was a man who looked like a shadow of humanity, thin, disheveled, and haunted. His wild, darting eyes held a dangerous glint, though he offered no resistance. The officer who stayed with me later explained the horrifying truth. The man had been standing outside my locked bathroom door, clutching one of my kitchen knives, waiting for me to step out. Chills raced down my spine. The realization that I had unknowingly been so close to danger left me lightheaded. The intruder had slipped into my apartment while I was retrieving my mail, silently finding his way under my bed, where he waited. His intentions, though unspoken, were clear enough to terrify in the aftermath. I learned that the man was homeless and suffering from severe mental health issues. He was taken to a psychiatric facility for treatment. While I was relieved to be physically unharmed, the incident left an indelible mark on my sense of security. Even now, the thought of returning home to an empty apartment fills me with unease. I was 21 when my girlfriend and I decided to spend a weekend in my family's vacation mobile home. It was an old, modest retreat tucked deep within a dense forest, miles away from the nearest neighbor or town. That night, a fierce snowstorm raged outside, blanketing everything in an unforgiving layer of white. The wind howled like a wild animal, shaking the fragile wooden structure of the mobile home. Inside, we sat on the couch next to the heater, wrapped in a blanket, snuggling for warmth as we watched late-night television. The coziness of the moment was deceiving. The mobile home was more rustic than secure, with a flimsy wooden door that had a broken lock. My grandfather, practical as ever, had stacked a few cinder blocks in front of the door during his last visit, a makeshift barrier that would hardly deter anyone determined enough to come inside. Despite this, I had always felt safe here, surrounded by nothing but endless forest. The snowstorm muffled the usual forest sounds, creating an eerie silence between the howling gusts. We'd been sitting there for a while when my girlfriend suddenly stiffened beside me. She grabbed my arm, her fingers trembling. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the television. I shook my head. Probably just the wind, maybe a deer or something," I said, trying to reassure her, but her unease was contagious. I turned the volume down and listened intently. For a few moments, there was nothing but the wind rattling against the windows. Then I heard it in a faint noise coming from outside, like something metal being moved. "It'd probably the old mower shed," I said, trying to sound confident. "If the winder's strong enough to knock something over." She wasn't convinced, and truth be told, neither was I. The sound didn't fit the randomness of the storm. It was deliberate. Someone was out there. "Go check," she urged, her wide eyes locking onto mine. "Are you kidding?" I hissed. "In this weather? If someone out there, they know we in here. Look at the lights." I gestured to the glowing interior of the mobile home, visible from every angle outside. My car, parked just a few feet from the shed, was half buried in snow, but its presence was another clear indicator of occupancy. The sound stopped. We sat frozen, staring at each other, hearts pounding. After a few minutes of tense silence, I convinced myself it was nothing. I turned off the inside lights and cautiously peeked out through the blinds. The world beyond was a blur of white, the snowstorm reducing visibility to almost nothing. I flicked on the porch light, and a cold dread settled over me. There, in the snow, were footprints. They weren't the irregular prints of an animal. These were distinct, human, and they led from the shed toward the backyard. My chest tightened as I moved toward the back window. My girlfriend followed closely, her breathing shallow. I hesitated for a moment before pulling the curtain aside. She screamed before I could, standing motionless in the backyard. Barely visible against the dark was a man. He wore all black, his face obscured by a vendetta mask, the kind that grins in eerie defiance. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring directly at the window. I dropped the curtain, heart hammering in my chest. "Get in the bedroom," I said, my voice shaky but firm. Now, my girlfriend didn't argue. She darted down the short hallway, while I moved toward the closet, grabbing my grandfather's old hunting rifle. My hands fumbled as I loaded it, adrenaline making me clumsy. I shoved the cinder blocks and whatever heavy objects I could find against the front door, barricading it as best as I could. The blinds were drawn, the lights off. The storm outside now seemed like the least of our concerns. We huddled in the corner of the bedroom, the rifle clutched tightly in my hands. My girlfriend clung to me, tears streaming silently down her face. For a while it was quiet, but then it came to sound of banging on the front door. It wasn't frantic, but measured, as if whoever was outside wanted to scare us more than break in. Each bang echoed through the small mobile home, rattling the walls. I tightened my grip on the rifle, every instinct in me screaming to protect us. The banging stopped as abruptly as it started. Minutes felt like hours as we waited in the suffocating silence. The only sound now the muffled storm outside. My mind raced. What if he was still out there? What if he found another way in? Eventually, exhaustion claimed my girlfriend, and she fell asleep against me. I stayed awake the entire night, the rifle never leaving my hands. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind made my pulse spike, but no other sounds came from outside at first light. We packed up our things as soon as the storm eased enough for us to see the road we left. I couldn't bring myself to look back as I drove away. Later that day, my grandparents called to tell me there were no signs of a break-in or theft. The cinder blocks were still by the door. The mower shed was untouched. It was as if nothing had happened, but I knew better. Someone had been there, and they wanted us to know it. Back when my grandmother was still alive, I had a cherished routine. Every afternoon I would walk down the block to her quaint, time-worn house to help her with various chores. It was a small thing, but it made her day and mine. She was a meticulous woman, one who never left things to chance, especially her home security. Her front door was always locked, her windows firmly latched, and she never failed to double-check everything before settling in for the night. One particular day, I made my usual walk to her house. The air was crisp, carrying a faint chill, and the street was unusually quiet, as though the world had momentarily held its breath. When I arrived at her door, I reached for the knob out of habit. To my surprise, it turned freely. The door was unlocked. A chill that had nothing to do with the weather ran down my spine. Grandma was the most cautious person I knew. She would leave the door open, not even if she was expecting me. Something was off. Pushing the door open, I stepped inside and called out, "Grandma!" My voice echoed faintly in the silence. The house felt wrong, as though the familiar warmth had been replaced with something colder, more sinister. From upstairs, I heard the sound of drawers opening and closing, sharp, hurried movements. It was coming from her bedroom. I craned my neck toward the staircase, calling out again, "Grandma, is that you?" No answer came. My footsteps felt thunderous as I ascended the stairs, the wooden boards creaking in protest. Her bedroom door was ajar, and I could see the edge of her dresser from the hallway. The shuffling sounds continued, more frantic now, as though someone was searching for something. My unease deepened with each step. When I was about 5 feet from the door, it slammed shut with a force that reverberated through the house. I froze in place, my heart pounding like a war drum. Swallowing hard, I knocked on the door and asked, "Grandma, is everything all right?" My voice betrayed the growing tremor of fear. At that exact moment, my cell phone buzzed in my pocket. Startled, I pulled it out and saw her name flashing on the screen. Confusion replaced my fear for a brief moment. How could she be calling me when she was just on the other side of this door? I answered, "Hello?" Her voice came through, calm and slightly apologetic. "Sweetheart, don't come over today. I'm heading to the seniors club, and I want to be home." The room spun as her words sank in. My breath caught in my throat, and my grip on the phone tightened. I could hear the faint chatter of people in the background, confirming her location. "Okay, Gran," I managed to say, keeping my tone steady. "It's see you tomorrow." Hanging up, I stood there for a moment, my mind racing. I knew then that whatever, was behind that bedroom door was my grandmother. Thinking quickly, I forced my voice to sound nonchalant. "All right, Grandma, I'll wait for you downstairs." I turned and made my way to the kitchen, the weight of unseen eyes pressing against my back. Once there, I grabbed a knife from the drawer and dialed 911, keeping my voice low as I explained the situation to the dispatcher. Minutes felt like hours as I waited for the police. The house was eerily silent. Not a single sound came from upstairs. My heart was a relentless drumbeat in my chest, my grip on the knife slick with nervous sweat. When the flashing red and blue lights finally painted the walls of the house, I exhaled a breath I had realized I was holding. The officers stormed inside, their heavy boots pounding against the floorboards as they made their way upstairs. I stood frozen in the kitchen, listening. The sharp crack of a gunshot shattered the tense silence. I flinched, the sound ringing in my ears. Moments later, paramedics arrived and wheeled out the intruder. My stomach churned as I caught sight of his face. Dee was my grandmother, next-door neighbor, a man I had seen dozens of times. Always polite, always smiling. The officers explained that he had likely seen my grandmother leave the house and decided it was the perfect opportunity to break in and steal valuables. When they entered the bedroom, they found him hiding behind the door, a large knife clutched in his hand, waiting for someone to walk in. If I had received that phone call from my grandmother, or if I had opened that door instead of calling for help, I would be here to tell this story. To this day, the thought sends shivers down my spine. It was a crisp, calm evening as my wife and I returned home from a rare night out, savoring the afterglow of a pleasant dinner. The cool breeze nipped at our skin as we stepped out of the car and walked toward our house, the street lamp casting a gentle golden hue over the driveway. But the comfort of the evening shattered in an instant. Our front door was ajar. At first, I thought it might have been a trick of the light or a draft from a window left open. I looked at my wife. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, mirrored the unease bubbling up inside me. "Stay here," I said firmly, raising a hand to halt her. She nodded, clutching her purse tightly against her chest. I pushed the door open slowly, the creak cutting through the stillness of the night. My heart pounded in my chest like a drumbeat. My first instinct led me upstairs. My wife's shotgun, derelict from her father, was hidden in our bedroom closet, a precaution we had rarely needed to think about until now. Adrenaline coursing through my veins, I retrieved the weapon and loaded it with trembling hands. Every click of the shells sliding into place seemed deafening in the silence. With the gun ready, I began my search. The upstairs rooms were eerily undisturbed. I moved deliberately, my footsteps soft but purposeful on the carpeted floor, my eyes scanning every shadow and corner. There was nothing out of place. No drawers rifled through, no signs of intrusion. It was as if the house itself held its breath. Satisfied that the second floor was clear, I descended to the main level. The living room was undisturbed, our furniture as we had left it. The kitchen counters held only the remnants of the morning coffee cups, and the dining room stood still, its chairs neatly pushed in. Yet the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. Finally, I made my way to the basement. Darkness greeted me as I switched on the light. The faint hum of the furnace was the only sound. I swept through every corner, my shotgun leading the way, but again there was nothing. No sign of forced entry, no signs of life. I returned to the main floor and called the police, my voice steadier than I felt. When they arrived, I explained what had happened. 2 officers conducted a thorough search, starting upstairs and working their way down. Their flashlights illuminated corners and crevices I might have missed, but their search turned up empty as well. The officers eventually asked the inevitable question, "Are you sure you closed the door when you left?" I hesitated, doubt creeping in. Had I? My wife, however, was resolute. "Yes," she insisted, her voice firm despite her trembling hands. "We always lock it when we leave." The officers exchanged glances. They seemed convinced that if someone had been there, they were long gone. With no signs of burglary or disturbance, they left us with a warning to stay vigilant. My wife was inconsolable, her worry manifesting in quiet tears. I held her, whispering reassurances. I was sure I believed myself. "It beat over," I told her, stroking her hair. Whoever it was, they'd gone now, but the house felt different, cold and unwelcoming. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the wind against the windows made us flinch. Hours passed, and I finally drifted into a fitful sleep, the shotgun within armor reach. I was jolted awake by a blood-curdling scream. I shot upright, adrenaline surging as I turned to my wife. She sat frozen, her wide eyes locked on the closet across the room. Her trembling finger pointed toward it. I saw him," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Here and there." Her words hit me like a lightning bolt. My stomach sank as I realized my mistake. In my rush to search the house, I had checked the larger closet, but forgotten the smaller one in the second closet. For a split second, the room seemed to stand still. Then I saw it, a head just barely visible through the sliver of space between the closet door and its frame. A pair of eyes stared back at me before the door closed with a soft, deliberate click. Time slowed as I reached for the shotgun. My hands moved instinctively, loading and cocking the weapon in one smooth motion. The sound of the shotgun echoed through the room, my unspoken warning to the intruder. "Come out!" I shouted, my voice firm and commanding. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the closet door creaked open, revealing the shadowy figure of a man. But instead of surrendering, he bolted, moving with terrifying speed. He darted past me and down the stairs, his footsteps echoing through the house. I raced after him, my pulse pounding in my ears. At the front door, he threw it open and disappeared into the night, leaving it swinging on its hinges. I raised the shotgun, my finger hovering over the trigger. I could do it. My hand trembled, and he vanished into the darkness. We called the police again, and they arrived within minutes. A new search was conducted, but it was futile. He was gone, leaving no trace behind. There were no fingerprints, no identifying details, nothing. The officers assured us that the shotgun had likely saved us from something far worse, but their words offered little comfort. For days I replayed the events in my mind, haunted by the sight of his eyes staring out from the closet. I couldn't shake the thought of what might have happened had my wife not woken up, or if I had grabbed the gun. He was never caught. The memory of that night still lingers, a chilling reminder of how fragile the illusion of safety can be. And every time I walk past that closet, I feel the weight of his presence, even though I know he's long gone. About a year ago, I was still living with my parents, comfortably tucked away in the room I had called my own for years. It wasn't unusual for me, a 26-year-old, to spend late nights lying awake, my mind lost in the vast corridors of thought. But on one particular night, the familiar stillness of my bedroom took an eerie turn as I lay staring at the faint shadows cast by the moonlight. A soft, creaking sound broke the silence. My heart skipped. The noise was unmistakable. It came from across the room. Slowly turning my gaze, I saw it. My closet door, which I was sure had been closed, now hung ajar. I sat up, the hair on my arms standing on end. For a moment, I debated calling out for my parents, but decided against it. I wasn't a child anymore. I needed to face whatever this was. Mustering some courage, I got up, my feet touching the cold floor. Step by step, I approached the dark void of the open closet. Reaching out, I hesitated, then swung the door wide open. My eyes darted to every corner, scanning for something, someone, anything, but the closet was empty as it should be. Turning to brush off the unease, I shut the door firmly and climbed back into bed. Yet, sleep didn't come easily. Minutes turned into hours as I stared at the ceiling, replaying the event in my head. Just as my eyelids grew heavy, another noise shattered the fragile quiet. A low, rumbling sound above me. My body tensed as I realized it was coming from the air ducts. It was faint at first, like a distant hum, but it grew louder, resembling something rattling through the metal shafts. My logical mind fought to rationalize it. Could it be an animal? Maybe the heating system was acting up. The sound eventually faded, and with it, my lingering fear subsided. By morning, it felt almost like a hazy memory. At breakfast, I mentioned the noises to my dad. I told him about the rattling and the odd behavior of my closet door. But to my annoyance, he barely looked up from his coffee. He waved it off as nothing more than house sounds, perhaps a loose vent or old hinges, frustrated. I dropped the subject. That night, the unease from the previous evening lingered as I lay in bed. It wasn't long before I heard it again, the unmistakable creak of the closet door. My pulse quickened. I sat up sharply, staring at the door as it slowly swung open. The silence in the room felt alive, oppressive. This time, fear gripped me harder. I absolutely knew I had shut that door tightly. Despite my terror, I forced myself out of bed. My legs felt like lead as I approached the closet, every step accompanied by the growing thump of my heartbeat. I turned on the light and flung the door open with more force than I intended. Nothing. The space was empty, just as before. Turning to calm myself, I examined the doorknob and latch. Could it be loose? Was there a draft I hadn't noticed? It was the only explanation I could cling to as I stood there. The rattling from the air ducts began again, low and insistent. I froze, staring at the ceiling. Morning came too slowly, and I managed to convince my dad to inspect the closet door. He tested it, pulling and pushing, but it stayed firmly shut. "See? In fine," he said, giving me a pointed look that said he thought I was overreacting. "Maybe you're just not latching it properly." I wanted to argue, to explain how careful I had been, but the words caught in my throat. What good would it do? My parents did believe me. Determined to get answers, I decided to stay awake the following night. I sat on my bed, eyes fixed on the closet door, waiting. Hours passed, and nothing happened. Just as I began to feel foolish, a soft creak echoed through the room. My stomach dropped as the closet door inched open again, but this time there was no sound from the ceiling, only silence. The air felt heavy, charged with an invisible tension. I turned on my lamp, casting its warm glow around the room. My eyes drifted to the vent above me, and then I saw it. Two wide, unblinking eyes stared down at me from the shadows of the vent. For a split second, my brain struggled to process what I was seeing. My breath caught, and a scream tore from my throat, loud and piercing. The door to my room burst open as my parents rushed in. I pointed frantically at the vent, my words tumbling out incoherently. "There, Ann, someone in there, I saw it!" They exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of concern and frustration. My dad grabbed a flashlight and climbed onto a chair to inspect the vent. His face softened as he peered inside. "There ain't nothing here," he said firmly. "You've been staying up too late, letting your imagination run wild." I protested, pleaded, trying to make them understand, but their skepticism was unshakable. They chalked it up to exhaustion, a dream brought on by lack of sleep. Even now, as I sit and write this, the memory remains vivid. The creak of the door, the rattling above, and those eyes staring at me. I've never believed in the supernatural, but I also can find a rational explanation for what happened during those nights. Living in the quiet Poconos with my wife and 2 kids felt like the dream. Our home, nestled among the rolling hills, had a slice of paradise just a quarter-mile away, a small secluded lake surrounded by tall pines and thick underbrush. It became our escape, a little haven for swimming and picnics, a spot where my kids could splash around and laugh freely. But now that lake has turned into a source of dread, and I can let them near it ever again. Not after what happened last Saturday. We gone down as usual to spend the afternoon by the water. It felt perfect. The sun shining down on us as we set up our chairs on the sandy shore, the kids racing to the water with uncontainable excitement. My wife and I leaned back, soaking in the warmth, while the kids, ages 6 and 8, alternated between building sandcastles and wading into the shallow water. I always warned them not to venture too far out. They were still too young, and the lake's depth seemed ominous. They didn't need much convincing usually, but kids will always test their limits. For 2 blissful hours, everything was fine. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky with soft hues of pink and orange. My wife decided to head back to the house, tired from the day in activities, leaving me to supervise the kids a while longer. I stayed seated, watching them from a distance as they frolicked in the water, the ripples glinting like liquid gold in the fading light. That yen when I noticed it at first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Something dark, a round, shadowy mass, floated on the surface of the water, bobbing with the gentle waves. I squinted, leaning forward in my chair, trying to make sense of it. The object wasn't stationary. It was moving, slowly, deliberately, closer to where my kids were playing. My heart kicked up its pace as an inexplicable sense of dread washed over me. "Kids, come back to the shore!" I shouted, trying to keep the alarm out of my voice. They did seem to hear me, their laughter carrying over the water. Panic surged through me. I jumped to my feet and waded in, the cold water biting at my legs as I called out again, louder this time. Finally, they noticed me, their heads turning with confusion. I motioned frantically for them to come to me as they trudged through the water toward me. I glanced back at the shadowy object. It had vanished. My heart sank, replaced by an icy chill that had nothing to do with the water. Grabbing each of my children by the arm, I hurried them out of the lake. They looked up at me, puzzled by my urgency, but I offered no explanation. What could I say? That I'd you seen something in the water? Something that didn't belong? We packed up in silence and walked back home, the evening air heavy with unspoken tension. My wife greeted us with dinner, but I could hardly eat. My mind replayed the scene over and over. The dark, floating shape moving with intent, the way it disappeared the moment my kids were safe. What was it? A trick of the light? Debris? Or something worse? What went wrong? My wife asked, noticing how I pushed my food around my plate. Nanak, I mumbled. I did have the words and the courage. Didn't tell her what I did sing. Not yet after dinner, as the house settled into its usual nighttime quiet, I grabbed a flashlight. I told my wife I needed some air and stepped out, heading back toward the lake. The night was moonless, the path through the woods eerily dark and silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. I don't know what I was hoping to find. Maybe some proof that my fears were unfounded, that it really had been nothing. When I reached the lake, its surface gleamed faintly under the beam of my flashlight. The stillness felt oppressive, the usual nighttime sounds of frogs and crickets strangely absent. I swept the light across the water, scanning every inch for the dark shape. Nothing, just ripples lapping gently at the shore, and then a loud splash shattered the quiet. My pulse spiked as I whipped the flashlight toward the sound. Something had broken the surface of the water, something large. The ripples spread outward, growing wider, but I could see what had caused it. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, my breath shallow and quick. Then I saw it standing waist-deep in the water was a figure, humanoid, but wrong. Its long black hair hung down in matted strands, covering its face entirely. The light from my flashlight glinted off its wet, pallid skin. It stood motionless, as though watching me, though I could see its eyes. A shiver of pure terror gripped me. My legs locked in place, and for a moment, I felt paralyzed. Suddenly, the figure shifted, its head tilting slightly, as if curious. I could take it. The flashlight slipped from my hand, plunging the scene into darkness as I turned and bolted, sprinting back through the woods. Branches snagged at my clothes, the uneven ground threatening to trip me, but I did stop until I reached the safety of my house. Slamming the door shut behind me, I leaned against it, gasping for breath. I haven't told anyone what I saw. Not my wife. Not my kids. How could they do think I lost my mind? But I know what I saw was real. And now, every time I glance out the window, I can shake the feeling that something might be out there watching. The month of October 2016 was anything but ordinary. It was the peak of Halloween season, and I found myself working a seasonal night shift at Party City. The store was alive with the frantic energy of customers scrambling for costumes and decorations, but as the hours stretched toward midnight, that liveliness would fade into an eerie stillness. During this season, the store extended its weekday closing hours to 11 p.m., making my shift stretch from 5 p.m. until closing. The busiest hours would die down after 9, and by 10, the store was almost ghostly quiet, especially on weekdays. This particular night began like any other. I started my shift as Eva costume grabber, tasked with fetching costumes and sizes as requested over walkie-talkie. Customers would try them on, and I'd move on to the next request by late evening. The rush had ebbed away, leaving only 4 of us in the store. Maria, stationed at the register. Kyle, methodically cleaning and restocking shelves. Ashley, our supervisor, and me. As the hours dragged on, I transitioned to restocking duties, which often required trips to the basement. That part of the job wore me out quickly. The basement was connected to the upstairs costume storage room by a set of narrow stairs, and Sojourner, that seemed to grow longer with every trip. Around 10:30, I trudged back to the basement, only to find the lights had been turned off, assuming Ashley had done it while tidying up. I flipped them back on and descended. The basement was cramped. A circular room crammed with shelves and boxes. I grabbed a box of girls' costumes and was preparing to head back upstairs when a loud thud echoed from the far side of the room. I froze. The sound had come from behind the central shelf. Heart pounding, I cautiously leaned around the corner. There, standing motionless, was a figure in a white hooded robe, complete with a grotesque monster mask. My breath caught in my throat, and I instinctively stepped back, my mind racing to rationalize what I was seeing. "All right, you got me," I called out, assuming it was one of my coworkers playing a prank. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it tilted its head to one side, the gesture eerily deliberate. A chill crept down my spine as I realized the person was too tall to be Ashley. It had to be Kyle. Determined to unmask him, I approached, but as I moved closer, the figure took a step back, maintaining an unsettling silence. That time when I noticed the boots, sleevey, grimy work boots that I was certain Kyle wasn't wearing. A wave of dread washed over me. Without another word, I backed away and climbed the stairs at a measured pace, resisting the urge to run. I didn't want to tip off whatever was down there. Once I reached the main floor, I hurried to Ashley, who was chatting with Maria at the register. "Where are Kyle?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Before Ashley could answer, Kyle's voice rang out from a nearby aisle. "What are you up?" Panic took hold of me. I stammered out an explanation of what I'd seen in the basement. Ashley frowned, but grabbed Kyle and followed me back down. The basement was empty. The air was thick with unease, but the figure was gone. A quick search revealed that the back exit in the upstairs costume room, a door used for unloading shipments, was wide open. Ashley reviewed the security footage, but there was no sign of anyone entering or exiting the costume room aside from me. The basement and costume room had no cameras, leaving us with no evidence of what had transpired. Though unnerved, I tried to shake it off. I still had work to finish. Reluctantly, I returned to the basement to retrieve the box I'd left behind. Every creak and rustle seemed magnified in the oppressive silence. As I hefted the box up the stairs, a faint noise reached my ears, the crumpling sound, like a plastic bag being disturbed. I stopped in my tracks, straining to pinpoint the source. My imagination screamed at me to leave, but I could shake the feeling that I was alone. I made it to the costume room, dropped the box, and hurried back to the basement door to shut off the light. But before I did, I glanced down the staircase. At the bottom, the figure stood again. This time, the mask was gone. His face was pale, with sharp features twisted into a wide, unnatural grin. His eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a primal terror take hold. Slamming the door, I bolted for the front of the store, shouting for help. Ashley and the others rushed to the costume room, but the back exit was wide open again. The figure had vanished. The security camera covering the outside delivery area showed nothing. No movement, no trace of him. The rest of the night passed in a blur of fear and unanswered questions. Had the figure stolen something? Was it a cruel Halloween prank? Or had his intentions been far darker? October has always been my favorite month. Tea here is something magical about it. A perfect balance of crisp air and gentle breezes, neither too hot nor too cold. The leaves morph into fiery shades of orange and brown, carpeting the ground with autumn's essence. My friends and I, at ages 9 to 12, had a cherished tradition, raking leaves into a massive pile and wrestling in it like professional wrestlers. It was an October evening, toward the end of the month, the kind where most trees had already surrendered their foliage. My property was the largest among my friends, Lime, and Billy, so naturally we used it for our wrestling matches. The house we lived in at the time was on a corner lot, with a sprawling side yard next to a quiet, dead-end street. Two houses marked the end of that street, one owned by a carefree older couple who rarely left their haze-filled haven, and the other a decrepit little home whose reclusive owner was a ghost in the neighborhood. That day, we spent hours crafting the perfect pile of leaves. The wind was picking up, swirling the leaves in tiny, erratic dances. After an exhausting half-hour of play, we retreated inside for snacks and video games. But the pull of the autumn night and the allure of another triple-threat wrestling match in the leaves lured us back out. The streetlight at the dead end provided just enough illumination to see our surroundings. Yet something felt off as we approached our pile, was noticeably smaller. We shrugged it off and began raking to restore its grandeur. That and when Liam spotted something odd. About 10 feet from our pile was a long, misshapen lump of leaves. "Hey, here's something under here," Liam called out. His voice carried a mix of curiosity and unease. Billy and I dropped our rakes and hurried over together. We began brushing away the leaves, and our breath caught when we uncovered a man's body lying motionless beneath them. We froze, our gazes darting between each other and the figure. Was it a prank? A Halloween joke gone too far? "Go on. Bill, Lime dared," his voice shaky, but attempting bravado. Billy hesitated before stepping closer. His kicks grew bolder, scattering the leaves away from where the man in face should have been. His foot struck something unnaturally hard, hollow. The body wasn't real. He is a fake. Relief was short-lived, replaced by confusion and unease. Who would plant this here? I wondered aloud. Our question was answered almost immediately from the bushes nearby. A shadow stirred. A raspy laugh pierced the silence, and out stepped a man who looked like he'd been dragged straight out of a nightmare. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with bulging eyes and crooked teeth that seemed to leer at us even when his mouth was closed. His heavy breathing added an ominous rhythm to the encounter. "Got you good, didn't I?" he wheezed between chuckles. We stood paralyzed, caught between fear and disbelief as he explained. "I watch you kids play all the time. Thought you'd have some fun." The way he said, "Watch you kids," sent a chill down my spine. Lime tried to laugh it off, thanking him for the Adam Prime, but I was buying his act. "Come on, guy," I muttered, leading the way inside. Once safe indoors, I told my dad about the man. He went out to check, but by then, the stranger and his bizarre decoy were gone, shaking it off. We spent the rest of the night gaming, but none of us could entirely forget the man and unsettling presence later. After my friends left, I retreated to my room. I always kept my window open for the October breeze. The comforting sound of rustling leaves was interrupted by something far less welcome. A voice. "I didn't mean to scare you earlier." It whispered, raspy, and close my heart leapt into my throat as I turned toward the window. Standing in the shadows was the man from earlier. His face, now lit faintly by the moonlight, was grotesque in its detail. He leaned closer, his breath fogging the glass. "I live just across the street. I like watching you kids play." I froze as he reached his arm under the window, trying to push it open further. His hand groped for the frame, and when he realized he could climb through, he stretched, trying to reach me instead. Panic overwhelmed me, and I screamed for my dad, bolting upstairs to wake him. By the time we returned to my room, the man had vanished. I told my dad he lived in the house across the street. Without hesitation, he grabbed a flashlight and stormed over, banging on the door. The house remained dark and silent. Frustrated, my dad called the police. When they arrived, the man finally opened the door. His appearance was even more disheveled up close, and it became clear to the adults that he was under the influence of something. My dad later explained it was likely meth. I remember peering past the threshold and seeing a chaotic mess of trash, broken furniture, and a haunting sense of neglect. The police warned him to stay away from us, but thinking back, it's chilling to realize how long he might have been watching us from the shadows of his dilapidated home. This past October, I reconnected with a girl I'd met at a party a month prior. For the sake of this story, let her call her Nikki. We'd been hanging out about once a week, and she was all in on doing traditional October activities. When I suggested apple picking, she lit up at the idea. It felt like the perfect plan for a crisp autumn day. We set out for the nearest apple picking orchard, which was about a 30-minute drive from the suburbs to the quieter, more rural outskirts of New Jersey. With the abundance of orchards in the area, I let Nikki choose our destination. We were cruising down a scenic, near-deserted road, the kind of road framed by fiery fall foliage and the occasional weathered farmhouse, when we noticed an orchard that wasn't on our radar. A narrow dirt path led to a ramshackle wooden house surrounded by rows of apple trees. The house looked neglected, the paint peeling, and not a single car or person was in sight. There wasn't even a stand to indicate where to pay or check in. It gave off the eerie vibe of a place long abandoned, deliberately forgotten. We stepped out of the car, the crunch of dead leaves breaking the uneasy silence. Nikki seemed apprehensive, eyeing the decrepit house. "This does not feel right," she muttered. Her discomfort was palpable, so we decided to leave and head to the orchard we originally planned to visit. When we arrived at the next orchard, it was just as empty, though this one had a closed sign at the entrance. As we stood there contemplating, I had a reckless idea. What if we went back to the first orchard? It abandoned, so no one around. We do have the whole place to ourselves. Nikki hesitated, shifting on her feet, but eventually she agreed. I drove us back to the overgrown orchard, parking discreetly along the edge of the woods. The dense apple trees stood in perfect rows, their twisted branches heavy with fruit. A rickety wooden fence marked the property and boundary, but it was easy to climb over. Once inside, we were surrounded by the towering trees and hidden from view. The air was crisp, and the faint smell of apples lingered as we wandered through the rows, filling plastic bags with the few apples that weren't shriveled or rotting. The thrill of sneaking onto private property added a spark of excitement, and we were laughing as I tossed apples high into the air. I started playfully, pretending to throw them at Nikki, who squealed and darted between trees, scolding me as she went. "I'm picking my own apples," she yelled, her voice drifting from a few rows away. I called back, teasing, "Oh, don't get lost." Minutes passed, and I realized I couldn't see her anymore. I called out again, but there was no answer. Suddenly an apple landed, with a dull thud a few feet from me. I looked around, puzzled, and then another one landed closer. "Okay, stow," I said, a hint of nervousness creeping into my voice. "Seriously, Nikki, cut it out." I moved toward the direction of the thrown apples, squeezing between trees, scanning each row as I passed. Then I froze. About 5 trees away, standing motionless in the middle of a row, was a young man. He looked no older than 19, with long, unkempt black hair that brushed his shoulders. His face was pale, and a faint smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. He didn't move, didn't say anything, just stared. A cold wave of dread rolled over me. My instinct screamed to get out of there. I stepped back, pushing through the branches to the next row, and then the next, putting distance between us. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I answered it in a whisper. It was Nikki. "Where are you?" I asked urgently. Her voice was shaky, panicked. "Therein, a creepy guy following me. I tried talking to him, but he just stared at me, like me." She trailed off, her breath hitching. "He looked like he wanted to hurt me." Her description matched the man I just seen. My stomach churned. "Meet me back at the car," I said, my voice low but firm. Now I sprinted through the orchard, my heart pounding with every step. When I reached the car, Nicky was already there, her face pale. Before I could speak, she pointed ahead and gasped, "There he is." I turned and saw him. He was half hidden by an apple tree, only parts of his body visible. The edge of his face, his arm, his leg. He stood there motionless, watching us with that same unsettling smirk. I didn't wait to see what he would do. I jumped into the driver's seat, starting the car and spinning it around in a hurried three-point turn. As we drove away, the shadowy figure of the orchard receded into the distance. Nicky and I barely spoke until we spotted a fruit stand down the road. Desperate for some normalcy, we stopped to buy apples and berries. While there, curiosity got the better of me, and I asked the women working at the stand about the orchard we just come from. Their faces darkened, "Don't ever go near that place." One of them warned. She hesitated, as if weighing how much to tell us. The owner and son. He killed his girlfriend there years ago. Her body was found in the woods nearby. The son disappeared after that, and no one has seen him since. The orchard had been abandoned ever since, but the father still owns it. People say it had cursed. My heart sank as her words sank in. We were just there, I admitted, and some guy was following us. The women exchanged worried glances. "Eerie, lucky you got out." One of them said, "On next time, call the police." As we drove home, Nicky talked about the ordeal, but her words blurred into the background. My mind kept replaying that haunting smirk, the piercing gaze of the man in the orchard. Was it really him, the sick son of the orchard and owner? Or was he something worse, something tied to the tragedy that had consumed that place? The bushland stretched endlessly, the rough dirt path winding deeper into the wilderness, the thick canopy of trees blotting out the midday sun. It was there, 5 kilometers off any known trail, that I stumbled upon the farmhouse, now relic both haunting and pristine. The eerie quiet was its first betrayal. No rustling leaves, no chirping birds, only the occasional crunch of my boots on the dry leaves that littered the ground. The house loomed ahead, strangely untouched by time. Its white paint gleamed as if it had just been applied. The windows sparkled, and the porch looked sturdy enough to host a gathering. Adjacent to it stood a weathered bar, its paint peeling but its structure resilient against the passage of years. The incongruence between the two struck a chord of unease in me. Curiosity nudged me closer, and my first steps toward the barn revealed horrors I hadn't prepared for. Inside, the skeletal remains of horses and other animals lay scattered like grotesque art installations. Their bones were unnaturally clean, devoid of any decay or scavenger marks. My heart pounded in my chest, a primal warning urging me to turn back. Yet, the garden by the house was its own enigma. Rows of vibrant vegetables stood tall, their fruits glistening as if they had been tended to just this morning. The incongruity gnawed at me. He maintained this when everything else screamed abandonment. As I stepped closer to the house, a suffocating wave of terror enveloped me. It wasn't fear of the tangible, but something deeper, raw and instinctual. A loud, oppressive buzzing sound suddenly filled the air, making my ears ache, my vision blurred, a crimson haze creeping into the edges of my sight, and an acrid metallic taste coated my tongue. Panic clawed at my chest, and I stumbled backward. The sound faded as quickly as it had begun. I retreated to a nearby clearing, desperate to ground myself. Then came the voices, faint and elusive. They seemed to rise from beneath my feet, as if the earth itself was whispering secrets. I strained to listen, but could make out nothing intelligible. The whispers grew louder, their indistinct nature more maddening than clarity would have been. With every step I took to leave, the farmhouse seemed to pull me back. The voices followed, not as echoes, but as a constant presence in my ear, coaxing and cajoling. I quickened my pace, the heavy weight of unseen eyes pressing on my back. My breath quickened as a louder voice, guttural and frantic, emerged from the cacophony. It wasn't behind me. D was ahead. I froze, trying to steel myself. Something was there. Something I could see, but could feel in every fiber of my being. The ground beneath me seemed to tremble with low-pitched vibrations, each pulse resonating through my bones. My water bottle shook violently in my pack. The voice grew louder, panicked, and incomprehensible, and with it came an unbearable pressure in my skull. My nose bled freely, warm streaks trailing down my face. I was paralyzed with terror, unable to breathe, unable to think. My legs finally obeyed, and I ran, stumbling into a narrow clearing, just wide enough for sunlight to cut through. There, in the center, stood a stag, but this was no ordinary creature. Its antlers were twisted, unnaturally large, and its eyes glowed with an eerie white light, each orb pierced by a single black dot. The moment our eyes met, a cold black void swallowed me whole. I woke up gasping, my vision blurry and my head pounding. A suffocating weight pressed down on me, and I clawed at it until I realized it was a tarp. Save blue heavy sheet that reeked of mildew, my surroundings were alien yet familiar. The barn, how I had ended up there I did know. Panic spurred me into motion, and I bolted outside. The farmhouse was there again, pristine and silent, mocking my fear. I did hesitate this time. I ran uphill toward the ridge, the weight of the forest growing heavier with every step. The whispers had returned, now accompanied by crashing sounds in the underbrush. The pursuit was relentless. Whatever it was faster than me, closer with every breath. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees warping and shifting in my peripheral vision. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but I didn't dare stop. Finally, the dirt path gave way to gravel, and an old information board came into view. Relief surged as I spotted two hikers packing up their gear near the road. I stumbled toward them, collapsing into their concerned stares. One of them, a kind German woman, cradled my head in her lap and offered me water. She told me I had been unconscious for only 5 minutes, but I knew better. When I asked the time, her answer chilled me to my core. It was 4:37 p.m. I had entered the farmhouse clearing at 11 a.m. Where had those missing hours gone? Later, I returned to the farmhouse with a friend. The buzzing sound and metallic taste returned as we approached. We ventured into the barn, finding the tarp and a trail in the dirt as if something someone had been dragged. It was undeniable that I had been there, but the circumstances remained a terrifying mystery. We left in silence, neither of us daring to speak about the things we felt and saw. I've never returned to that farmhouse, and I never will. Whatever lingers there, it is meant to be understood or disturbed. In my early 20s, I worked as a construction worker and engineer in the Philadelphia area. My team specialized in structural add-ons, basements, extended floors, and the like. One project from 2012 still lingers in my memory, casting a shadow that refuses to fade. The job was straightforward. Construct a small basement with a bathroom and 2 storage areas for a coroner-dentist building, along with an extension to its main floor. By the time this particular incident occurred, the basement had been sealed off from the open earth and power had been connected. We had light down there, a rare luxury during night shifts. That evening, my coworker Jordan went upstairs to assist with work on the exterior addition. Meanwhile, I stayed below, tinkering with the electrical components. I was not an electrician, but I knew enough to troubleshoot basic issues. The faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead was suddenly replaced by silence as the power cut out. I knew immediately it was my fault. Likely a neighborhood outage, I reasoned. None of us carried our phones while working. Grimy hands and delicate electronics both mix, so they were upstairs in our jackets. Fortunately, every vest was equipped with a flashlight before I could reach for mine, though an unexpected sound froze me in place. It was a soft rattling. like a bag of coins being gently shaken. The sound echoed from the direction of the unfinished bathroom. My breath hitched. It wasn't a sound I could attribute to construction work or settling pipes. Fingers trembling, I retrieved my flashlight and aimed its beam toward the bathroom. The door, slightly ajar, blocked my view of the interior. Steeling myself, I approached. Each step felt like trudging through thickening air. I hesitated at the door, my hand hovering near its edge, heart pounding like a drumbeat in my ears. Then, with a sudden burst of courage, I yanked it open. The flashlight den beam landed on a figure dressed entirely in black, standing motionless in the corner. They faced the wall, their back to me, their posture rigid. My brain scrambled to rationalize what I was seeing. Was this one of my co-workers playing a prank? But their build didn't match any of the guys on my crew. But I could speak. The figure turned its head toward me. The movement was unnatural, quick and mechanical, like a deer startled in the woods. My flashlight caught the glow of two pale, unblinking eyes staring back at me. Panic surged through my body. I slammed the door shut, the sound reverberating through the basement. My boots clattered on the metal stairs as I sprinted to the upper floor, calling for my co-workers. I found all three of them outside, about to call it a night. A power outage had affected the surrounding area, and they were ready to pack up. My eyes darted between them, counting heads. 3. All accounted for. It could have been any of them. I breathlessly explained what I'd seen. None of them believed me, of course, though they humored me enough to follow me back downstairs. The atmosphere in the basement was oppressively silent. We checked the tiny bathroom, the storage areas, every corner. Nothing, no signs of the figure I could see. Embarrassment and frustration warred within me as we climbed back upstairs. My coworkers laughed it off, teasing me about my overactive imagination. I locked up the building after they left and got into my car, intending to follow them home. But I could shake the feeling. Something pulled at me, urging me to go back. Perhaps it was pride, or maybe I needed confirmation that I was losing my mind. Whatever the reason, I found myself unlocking the door and descending those stairs once more, armed with both my flashlight and my phone relight. The basement felt different this time. Heavier, darker. I reached the bottom step and stopped, my senses straining against the oppressive silence. Just as I was about to turn and leave, the rattling noise returned. It was louder this time, unmistakable, coming again from the tiny bathroom. My grip on the flashlight tightened. I didn't dare look. The air seemed to constrict around me, squeezing the breath from my lungs. Without a second thought, I bolted up the stairs, slammed the basement door shut, and locked it. This time, I didn't stop until I was behind the wheel of my car, speeding away from the building. I didn't sleep that night. The memory of those pale, glowing eyes haunted me, thankfully. It was a Saturday, so I had the rest of the weekend to compose myself. I vowed never to work alone in that basement again. It was an ordinary February night, the kind where the cold seeped through the windows despite the heater running full blast. My wife and I were nestled under the covers, watching a late-night movie in bed. The soft glow of the television flickered across the room as we both tried to fight off sleep. The plot had just reached its most gripping moment when, without warning, the television shut off. Instantly, the room was plunged into darkness. We both groaned in unison, annoyed at the sudden interruption. The lamps, alarm clock, and everything else powered by electricity had gone out. "Must be a power outage," I muttered, swinging my legs off the bed. My wife sighed and pulled the blanket tighter around herself. "I'll go check if the neighbors have power," I assured her. I grabbed a jacket and opened the front door. The icy February air bit at my skin as I stepped onto the stoop. Squinting into the darkness, I noticed that the neighboring houses still had their lights on, their warm glows cutting through the night. It was just us who had lost power. I rubbed my hands together and hurried back inside. The fuse box was located in the basement, a small boiler-like room we rarely visited. It didn't seem likely that the problem was there, but it was the only place to start. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the stairs leading to the basement. A peculiar thing about our house is that the basement door is at the top of the stairs. Instead, you have to descend the steps to reach it, which always felt oddly unsettling. Half awake and shivering from the cold, I clomped lazily down the stairs. At the bottom, I reached for the doorknob and tried to push it open, but it would budge. Frowning, I jiggled it harder, but the door remained stubbornly shut. My wife must have locked it, I thought with a sigh. I trudged back upstairs to ask her for the key. She was already up, a hint of amusement playing on her face as she followed me to the kitchen, where we kept a rack of keys. She sifted through the cluster, finally pulling out the basement key and handing it to me. "Try not to break anything," she teased before heading back to the bedroom. Menk at the basement door, I inserted the key into the lock and turned it. The lock clicked, but when I pushed on the door, it still wouldn't open. Frustrated, I went back upstairs, calling for my wife. She came down, rolling her eyes and smirking at my apparent incompetence. "It is just a door," she joked, flashlight in hand. Before even inserting the key, she turned the knob, gave the door a firm push, and it creaked open effortlessly. I stared in disbelief, stammering out protests that it would open for me. She laughed, brushing off my excuses, and went back upstairs. Still shaking my head, I stepped into the basement and flipped the light switch. Nothing happened. I flicked it a few more times, but the room remained dark. Gripping the flashlight tighter, I made my way to the boiler room. Inside, I opened the fuse box and began flipping switches, one by one. At last, the lights came on, flooding the basement with an eerie glow relieved. I closed the small door to the fuse box, but a sound from outside the boiler room made me freeze. It was faint, but unmistakable. The soft creak of a door hinge. Heart pounding, I stepped out of the boiler room and shone my flashlight toward the basement closets. One door was shut, but the other was slightly ajar. I stood still, my breath caught in my throat. The thought struck me like a cold slap. How could the power have gone out in the first place? And what if the basement door wasn't locked earlier? What if someone had been holding it closed? Before I could process these thoughts, I heard it. A deep, guttural exhale coming from the cracked closet door. My stomach dropped, and a primal instinct took over. I bolted up the stairs, locking the basement door behind me with trembling hands. Bursting into our bedroom, I startled my wife awake, babbling incoherently about someone being in the basement. She sat up, wide-eyed. "What do you mean, someone went down there?" she asked. I couldn't answer properly. I was too shaken. Grabbing my phone, I called the police, my voice trembling as I explained the situation. They assured me someone would be there shortly. As we waited, the house seemed unnaturally quiet. Then the silence shattered with the sound of glass breaking from the backyard. I rushed to the window, but it was too dark to see anything beyond the faint reflection of my own panicked face. When the police arrived, I led them to the basement, my flashlight guiding the way. By the time we reached the closet, the door was wide open, revealing nothing but an empty space. However, in the far corner of the basement, they found shattered glass beneath a small, high window. Items from the shelves had been knocked to the floor, and scuff marks on the wall suggested someone had climbed up and escaped through the broken window. The officers searched the property but found no sign of the intruder. Whoever had been hiding in that closet was long gone that night. We left the lights on in every room and double-checked every lock in the house. My wife tried to reassure me, but neither of us slept much. The next day, we replaced the broken window and reinforced the basement door. We live in a quiet neighborhood, the kind where people don't bother locking their doors during the day. But after that night, everything changed. The thought that someone had been in our home, hiding in the shadows, still sends chills down my spine. It is a grim reminder that safety is never guaranteed, even in the most ordinary of places. I work as a janitor at a commuter college campus. An unremarkable job in most respects. My days are spent cleaning hallways, classrooms, and restrooms across various buildings. Most of my shifts are in the late afternoon and evenings, from 1 o'clock to 9 o'clock, when the campus is less populated. The quiet is a perk, usually, but that summer night changed everything. The storm was one of the fiercest Aidus seen in years. Rain lashed against the windows, and winds howled with relentless ferocity. It was the kind of storm that seemed to demand attention, its presence unavoidable even through the thick walls of the campus buildings. That evening, my assignment was the Activity Center Hall, a relatively quiet space that housed a ballroom, a small theater, and multiple rooms. By 7:30 p.m., I was deep in the building, cleaning the game room on the lower level. The storm's fury outside was a constant background noise, but it wasn't enough to prepare me for the sudden plunge into darkness. Without warning, the power went out. The room was swallowed by an oppressive blackness, save for the faint, eerie glow of a red exit sign near the stairwell. I instinctively pulled out my phone and called another janitor working in a different building. His voice was steady but laced with concern as he confirmed that the outage affected the entire campus. Likely the storm had knocked out the grid with nothing more to clean in the dark. I decided to head upstairs, following the crimson beacon of the exit sign. But just as I reached the base of the stairs, a shadow caught my eye. Someone peering around the corner at the top of the stairwell. I froze. "Hello, is someone there?" My voice was steady, but my heart raced. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it slipped away into the darkness above. My breath caught in my throat, but I reasoned with myself. It could be a student or staff member who hadn't realized the building was closing. I had a responsibility to ensure the place was empty before locking up. Bracing myself, I ascended the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the silent, pitch-black space. The upper floor was unnervingly quiet, illuminated only by dim emergency lights scattered throughout the hallway. These lights offered little comfort, casting small halos of visibility while leaving vast stretches of shadow. The hallway encircled the ballroom in a loop, and I began my rounds, checking each door and calling out for stragglers. "Anyone here? The building is closing," my voice echoed, but the emptiness seemed to absorb it. As I moved, the unmistakable sound of footsteps whispered behind me. I stopped dead in my tracks, my ears straining. Slowly, I turned under the glow of one of the emergency lights, but the hallway behind me was empty. "Hello," I called again, my voice wavering this time. No response. I quickened my pace, checking each room methodically. Classroom after classroom, bathroom after bathroom, all empty. My growing unease refused to subside. The oppressive darkness felt alive, wrapping around me like a tangible force. When I finished my rounds, I was certain I was alone. Yet, as I made my way back toward the main entrance, those footsteps returned, louder this time. I spun around to see a silhouette just beyond the edge of the nearest emergency light. A motionless, human-shaped shadow. "You need to leave the building," I demanded, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it turned and bolted down the hallway, vanishing into the shadows. My heart hammered against my ribs. I debated chasing them, but decided against it. This wasn't part of my job description, and the thought of confronting someone in the dark felt too dangerous. Reaching the front lobby, I prepared to leave and call campus security. But before I could step outside, something caught my eye. 20 feet away, in the dim glow of a half-open door, the silhouette was back. It lingered, unmoving, just watching. I swallowed hard, my breath shallow as I tried to make out details, but the figure remained featureless, a dark blot against the faint light. My instincts screamed at me to leave, and I did hesitate. I stepped outside into the storm, my phone already in hand, and dialed campus security. 2 officers arrived quickly, combing through the building with flashlights and radios. They found no one. Still, they assured me they'd patrol the area for the rest of the night. I tried to convince myself it was just some prank or a lost student, but my gut told me otherwise. Later that night, my phone buzzed. It was campus security. "Can you describe the person you saw?" the officer asked, his voice calm but serious. I hesitated. I didn't see much. Just a silhouette. No features, no details. Why? There was a pause before he delivered the news. A suspected criminal had been spotted near the campus earlier that evening. The dangerous individual fleeing from authorities. The description matched what little I had seen. My blood ran cold. I ended the call and sat in silence, the storm outside still raging. Every shadow in my room seemed to shift and writhe. Sleep eluded me that night. The thought that I may have been inches away from someone so dangerous was a weight I couldn't shake. The nights had a strange allure, the perfect mix of tranquility and unease. As a nighttime driver for a food delivery service, I was no stranger to the quiet hum of the roads and the occasional eccentric customer. Fridays and Saturdays were my busiest shifts. Those 2 nights guaranteed steady orders as people huddled at home or with friends, craving late-night indulgences. This particular Saturday night, the clock ticked past 1 a.m. when I got an order request. The customer, Kyle, wanted McDonald's. Simple enough, 2 hamburgers. He lived nearby, just a short drive away from my position. Following the app, I picked up the order from the nearest McDonald's, its neon lights buzzing faintly in the otherwise empty lot. It felt routine, almost mechanical, but I had no idea that this delivery would be anything but ordinary. Kylan House was on a dead-end street, branching off another dead end. The narrow road was eerily silent, flanked by thick trees that bordered the highway. His home was the last on the street, a modest structure sitting quietly under the oppressive stillness of the night. The place was unsettling. Shadows danced under the dim glow of a porch light, and the house itself seemed to exhale an air of neglect, not wanting to disturb the household at such a late hour. I called Kyle. The phone rang once before going straight to voicemail. Then, almost immediately, I received a text. "Come to the door." I approached the creaky wooden porch, food bag in hand. The door opened before I even had the chance to knock. A man stood there, bald, likely in his mid-30s. His appearance was striking, but not in a way that inspired comfort. His bald head gleamed under the porch light, and his unsteady stance revealed a certain drunkenness, but it was his breath. A rancid, stomach-churning odor that made me instinctively hold my breath. I could feel the bile rising in my throat as he muttered a slurred greeting. "The payment done on the app," I reminded him, hoping to make this interaction as brief as possible. "Yeah, but I got a tip for you," he replied, his gummy smile unnerving. "Mon, just set the food on the table. I grab it from the baste." Reluctantly, I stepped inside. The kitchen was dimly lit by a small nightlight, casting shadows that seemed to move with the flickering bulb. The stench in the room was overpowering, a nauseating mix of rot and mildew. Something about the place felt profoundly wrong, but the promise of a tip made me hesitate to leave immediately. Kyle disappeared into the basement, leaving me alone. Minutes passed, and his absence stretched into an uncomfortable eternity. Curiosity gnawed at me. I wandered into the adjacent living room, which was faintly illuminated by a flickering television screen. The smell here was even worse, a thick, putrid aroma that clung to the back of my throat. That, when I noticed the back door, it was slid open just enough to let the cold night air seep in. Hoping for a moment of relief from the overpowering smell, I stepped onto the back deck. Instead of fresh air, I was hit by a wave of something far more sinister. The buzzing of flies filled my ears, a constant droning sound that sent chills down my spine. A motion sensor light flickered on, illuminating the source of the stench. 2 large black garbage bags slumped near the corner of the deck. They were stuffed to the brim, oddly misshapen with long, unmistakably human-like forms protruding from them. My stomach lurched as realization struck. I stumbled backward, the air thick with the metallic tang of decay. Panicking, I rushed back inside, intent on leaving as fast as possible. Just as I reached the front door, I heard heavy footsteps ascending the basement stairs. Kyle emerged, a handful of crumpled bills in his hand. He called out to me, his voice low and casual, almost disarmingly friendly. "Hey, where you going?" he asked, his smile faltering as he noticed my unease. Thinking quickly, I stammered, "Oh, just needed to check something in my car." He handed me the bills, his eyes narrowing. Then his gaze shifted toward the back door. The light was still on, the evidence unmistakably visible from inside. His demeanor changed instantly. The gummy smile vanished, replaced by a hard, calculating glare. "You went out back, didn't you?" His voice was cold now, sharp with accusation. "No," I lied, my heart hammering in my chest. He stared at me for what felt like an eternity before stepping closer. His hand clamped onto my shoulder, his grip firm and unrelenting. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run. Summoning every ounce of courage, I yanked his hand off and bolted out the door. I barely made it to my car before I saw Kyle reappear, this time with a large metal rod clutched in his hand. He was running, sprinting, toward me. My fingers fumbled with the keys and I finally managed to start the engine just as he reached the car. His furious expression was seared into my mind as I sped away. Shaking, I pulled over a few blocks away and called the police. My words came out in a rush as I described everything. The smell, the bags, the man in erratic behavior. To my surprise, patrol cars arrived almost immediately. I drove back cautiously, staying just out of sight but close enough to watch. From my vantage point, I saw Kyle dragging the garbage bags toward the bushes in his backyard, clearly trying to hide them. It was too late. The officers arrived, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Kyle froze as they approached, his demeanor shifting from defensive to panicked. I stayed until the officers confirmed what I already knew. The bags contained human remains. Kyle, whoever he really was, had made the grave mistake of inviting someone into his nightmarish secret. As they hauled him away in cuffs, I couldn't help but shudder. I thought I was just making a routine delivery. Instead, I had walked into the home of a killer. Delivering food for an Asian eatery was far from glamorous, but the tips made it worthwhile. My best friend and I worked there together, though we were the only two who weren't Asian. He worked the counter and took phone calls while I handled deliveries, mod setup that suited me perfectly. One quiet night, during a shift we shared, my friend hung up the phone and told me there was an order to deliver. After the food was prepped, I was handed a brown paper bag and given an address. It was supposed to be a routine drop-off, but nothing about what followed was ordinary. The directions led me to a dirt driveway barely visible from the main road, cutting through overgrown vegetation. It was an enclosed property, but not the kind that screamed wealth or privacy. The house at the end of the driveway looked neglected, its yard overrun with weeds and tall grass. The structure itself was cloaked in darkness, no lights on, no signs of life. I hesitated. The scene was unsettling, so I called back to the restaurant. My friend passed the phone to our boss, whose response was predictably gruff. "Knock on the door. Don't waste the food," he barked in his thick accent. Was no other choice. I stepped out of my car. The grass was so high it brushed against my shins as I approached the porch. The wooden steps creaked beneath my weight, and when I reached the door, I noticed it didn't have a handle. I knocked loudly and waited, the silence of the night amplifying the sound. 30 seconds passed. No response. Frustrated, I returned to my car and texted my friend about the strange situation. When I looked back at the house, my stomach lurched. One of the upstairs lights had turned on. I debated leaving, but convinced myself to give it another shot. Maybe someone had been asleep and finally heard me. I returned to the door and knocked again, but before my fist could land a second time, the door cracked open slightly. No one stood there. The sight of the partially open door made my skin crawl. I called out, "Atto hello?" My voice echoed through the hollow house. No answer. Seconds dragged on, but no footsteps approached. Someone had to have opened the door. Did they expect me to come inside? Against my better judgment, I stepped over the threshold. The floorboards groaned under my sneakers, and the air inside was thick, stale. I called out again, louder this time. Then a voice responded. It was faint but clear. "Aquí arriba." I wasn't fluent in Spanish, but I knew enough to understand. Here and above. My eyes landed on a staircase at the center of the hallway, leading up into the shadows. Hesitating at the bottom step, I glanced upward and saw an arm extend over the ledge at the top of the stairs. The hand motioned stiffly, beckoning me forward. "Tengo tu comida." I stammered, my middle school Spanish coming back in fragments. I ascended cautiously, the creak of each step amplifying my dread. When I reached the midpoint, the arm was gone. At the top, I peered down the dim hallway, only to see the arm again, this time sticking out from a doorway, motioning in the same eerie manner. Something about it was wrong. The arm seemed unnaturally stiff, and beyond the elbow it faded into the shadows of the unlit room. I stopped in my tracks. My instincts screamed at me not to go further. Summoning what little courage I had, I called out, "Buddy, I'm not going in there. You want your food, come out here and pay for it." The arm jerked back into the room, disappearing into the darkness. I stood frozen, the silence pressing down on me. Then out of nowhere, something struck me hard. It hit my chest and tumbled to the floor. When I looked down, my breath caught in my throat. It was a severed arm, a real, human arm. Panic surged through me. I bolted down the stairs, clutching the food bag like a lifeline. I didn't look back as I fled the house and jumped into my car. My hands trembled as I started the engine and sped down the driveway. Dunaline still pumping. I stopped at the nearest house and rang the doorbell. A woman answered, her expression turning from confusion to concern, as I babbled about what had happened. When I mentioned the address, her face paled. "That house?" she said, her voice trembling. "Nobody lived there for over a year." Her words felt like a punch to the gut. My mind reeled as she assured me she would call the police. After a tense discussion, I thanked her and drove back to the restaurant, my heart still racing when I explained the incident to my boss. He waved it off, mumbling about kids playing pranks. But the memory of that house, that arm, and the eerie motion still haunts me. The Domino's on the edge of our small, sleepy town stayed open until 3 a.m. on weekends. That tan where I found myself during my gap year, thrown into endless night shifts by my manager, who took full advantage of my open schedule. The 9 p.m. to 3 a.m. shift had its challenges, but at least I wasn't alone. Jeff, the pizza cook, key gruff, no-nonsense guy in his late 20s who seemed perpetually annoyed, and a third coworker handling calls and orders were always around. That Saturday night felt like every other. the quiet hum of the shop broken only by the occasional late-night delivery. At 2:30 a.m., Jeff handed me 2 pizzas for an address that lingered vaguely in my memory, 27 Crocker Drive, Ive. Without much thought, I grabbed the pizzas and headed for my beat-up 2002 Honda Civic. The night stretched dark and quiet as I navigated the near-empty streets. The drive was uneventful until I turned onto a dirt road marked by a private property sign. The house came into view, a modest structure cloaked in shadows and surrounded by dense trees. It felt isolated, eerily so. The warm glow of lights through closed blinds contrasted sharply with the stillness around it. As I crept closer, a sudden bang shattered the silence, followed by a telltale flopping sound and a pull on the car's handling. My stomach dropped, a flat tire pulling over. I stepped out to confirm my suspicion. The front right tire was completely deflated, but the house wasn't far, so I grabbed the pizzas, deciding to deliver them first and deal with my car later. The porch creaked under my weight as I rang the bell, and soon a young man opened the door. He looked normal enough, almost too normal for someone living in such an isolated spot after exchanging the pizzas for cash. I mentioned my predicament. A flicker of concern crossed his face before he followed me to inspect my car. The man crouched by the tire, squinting at the damage in the dim light. "I can help," he said, "but I'll need to grab some tools from inside." As he turned back toward the house, I glanced around the dirt road. And when I spotted it, small spike strip partially hidden in the gravel, positioned exactly where my tire had passed. My heart raced as the realization hit. This wasn't an accident. I looked back toward the house where the man was already halfway to the door. If he noticed me lingering, he didn't show it. Pretending I had seen the strip, I called out, "I didn't find anything unusual." He didn't reply, disappearing inside. Panic bubbled under my calm facade. What were these tools he needed? Why the spike strip? I didn't wait to find out. Sliding into my car, I started the engine, the flat tire wobbling ominously as I reversed carefully down the dirt road. I avoided the spike strip this time, adrenaline sharpening my focus. The house faded into the distance, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. Just as I emerged onto the main road, I glanced in the rear view mirror. My blood ran cold. He was chasing me. The man sprinted down the road, his figure illuminated briefly in my taillights before disappearing into the darkness. My foot slammed on the gas, despite the cringe-worthy grinding from the damaged wheel. The distance between us grew, and eventually he vanished from view. But my relief was short-lived. The journey back to Domino was painfully slow. With the damaged tire, I could risk driving faster than 10 to 15 miles per each hour. When I finally pulled into the parking lot, my shift was nearly over. Jeff berated me for taking so long until I recounted the night bead events. His face darkened, and the other co-worker gasped audibly. We locked the doors and finished closing up, the unease in the air palpable on my drive home. The paranoia began to set in. The streets were eerily empty, but I could shake the feeling of being watched. Then, a car appeared in my rear-view mirror, its headlights off. It followed me closely, shadowing my every move. My chest tightened as I realized it had to be him. To touting my theory, I pulled over in front of a small house. The car passed me, but it stopped further down the road, parking on the same side. It was him. My hands trembled as I called the police, desperate for help. Minutes later, a patrol car approached. I honked, flagging the officer down. As we rolled our windows down, I pointed to the car up ahead, but before the cop could react, the other car roared to life, speeding off into the night with its lights still off. The officer didn't hesitate, flipping on his sirens and pursuing the fleeing vehicle. Alone again, I limped my car home. the damaged tire groaning with every turn. Once safely in my driveway, I sat in silence, trying to calm my frayed nerves. I never found out if the officer caught the man that night. But the encounter left a permanent mark. For weeks, I jumped at shadows and checked my rearview mirror constantly. 3 months ago, I decided to join a gym for the first time. It felt like a positive step toward a healthier lifestyle. Gyms aren't exactly places where you'd expect something terrifying to unfold, until last week, when I had the most unsettling experience of my life. I always wear wireless headphones during my workouts. The wired ones are a hassle. They tangle up and get in the way. Occasionally, I'll leave my phone on a workout machine while heading to the water fountain. When my phone gets too far from the headphones, the connection gets staticky before disconnecting entirely. It's a quirk I discovered a couple of times before. Last week, I found myself at the gym late at night, one of the last people still there. The air was heavy with the faint hum of machines and the rhythmic clinking of weights. I was seated at one of the leg press machines, determined to push through my final set of 20 reps. As I gritted my teeth and pushed toward the last rep, the music in my headphones started to distort. Static crackled ominously before the sound cut off completely. Confused, I stopped mid-set and reached over to the small compartment on the machine where I had placed my phone. My fingers met nothing but empty space. Panic began to seep into my chest as I frantically searched around the machine. My phone was gone. I scanned the nearly deserted gym. There were only 2 other patrons, a large, sweaty man struggling with a dumbbell, and another guy slouched on a machine engrossed in his phone. The front desk attendant was stationed nearby, casually typing away on his computer. My heart pounded as I tried to assess who could have taken my phone reluctantly. I approached the man with the phone. He seemed absorbed in whatever he was watching or texting, and I felt an overwhelming sense of intrusion as I walked up to him. He noticed me, his expression quickly shifting to irritation as he removed one earbud. "Did you take my phone?" I asked firmly, trying to mask the anxiety in my voice. He stared at me for a few seconds, his gaze sharp and defiant. Then, with a hint of annoyance, he simply said, "Number? Have you seen anyone else walk by recently?" I pressed. He shook his head dismissively and returned to his phone. Frustrated, I muttered a thank you and stepped away, though part of me wanted to demand a more thorough answer. Desperate for a resolution, I approached the front desk worker and asked if he could review the security camera footage. He nodded and pulled up the footage on his computer. As the screen displayed the gym's recent activity, my stomach sank. The rude guy I had confronted moments earlier appeared in the footage. There he was, casually snatching my phone from the machine and slipping it into his pocket before walking out of the gym. "That guy just left," I exclaimed, bolting toward the exit. But by the time I got outside, he was gone, vanished into the night like a shadow. The gravity of the situation hit me like a weight. I had recently disabled the passcode lock on my phone for convenience, giving him unrestricted access to my apps, emails, photos, and even my texts. My entire digital life was now in the hands of a stranger. I returned to the front desk, urging the employee to pull the Manon membership details from the system. But to my dismay, the guy had even checked in. He had bypassed the counter unnoticed, slipping in like a ghost. Reviewing the footage further revealed his suspicious behavior, hovering around machines, scanning the gym as if plotting his next move. The worker promised to inform the manager and report it to the police the next day. The following morning, I called my best friend, Tom, to explain why I might be unreachable for a while. As I recounted the story, his voice turned panicked. "Wait, what? Please tell me you're joking about losing your phone," he said, his words laced with urgency. "I wish I were," I replied. "Why?" Tom explained that someone had been taking him from my number, pretending to be me. Worse, This impersonator had asked if they could stay at his place after claiming to have a fight with my parents. They convinced Tom to leave his back door unlocked, claiming they'd arrive late and didn't want to wake him. 10 minutes later, Tom arrived at my house, visibly shaken. He showed me the text conversation. It started innocently enough, but grew more insistent. The impostor had even thanked Tom for leaving the door open. "We need to check the cameras," I said, my voice trembling. Together, we raced to Tommy's house. Reviewing the security footage confirmed our worst fears. The man from the gym, same one who stole my phone, was seen entering Tommy's home through the back door. He moved through the house with unsettling confidence, pocketing valuables and rifling through drawers. My stomach turned as I watched him creep upstairs. Tom froze when the intruder entered his bedroom. The man lingered there for about 20 seconds before exiting, leaving the door slightly ajar. The sight of him walking through the house, so casually violating Tom's sanctuary, sent chills down my spine. The man spent about 10 minutes inside before slipping out the same way he came, disappearing into the night once more. He had taken several expensive items, but the violation of privacy was the true theft. We submitted the footage to the police, who assured us they'd follow up. I also informed the gym manager, who promised to send their surveillance footage as well. The 24-hour gym in my small town had always been a haven of solitude for me. Its quiet halls and dimly lit corners offered a retreat from the chaos of daily life. During the day, a steady trickle of fitness enthusiasts came and went, but as night fell, the place transformed into a veritable ghost town. I often wondered how it managed to stay open around the clock, given how empty it could be after dark. One night, after covering a late shift for a coworker, I found myself driving to the gym at 11:30 p.m. The crisp night air carried an eerie stillness, and as I parked in the near-empty lot, a sense of unease settled over me. Shaking it off, I told myself it was just my overactive imagination. After all, this wasn't the first time I had been there alone at night. The gym interior was bathed in the artificial glow of overhead lights, their hum the only sound as I walked in. Rows of machines stood waiting like silent sentinels, and for a while I was the sole occupant of this quiet domain. That changed about 10 minutes into my workout. A man entered, his presence breaking the stillness. He wore a beanie pulled low and a hoodie, both dark and incongruous for a gym setting. I could help but notice how overdressed he seemed, especially compared to my tank top and shorts. Sweat pricked at my skin as I worked out, yet this man didn't remove a single layer. I found myself stealing glances at him, perplexed. It wasn't just his attire that struck me as odd, was the way he stared. His gaze locked onto me, unflinching and intense. At first, I tried to brush it off, chalking it up to some awkward coincidence. But as minutes ticked by, his unrelenting stare began to gnaw at my nerves. I returned his gaze briefly, hoping to silently communicate that I noticed his behavior. It did deter him. If anything, his focus sharpened, like a predator sizing up its prey. The air grew thick with discomfort, and I decided to move to a different section of the gym, seeking the solace of empty space. I found myself in the free weights area, facing a long wall of mirrors. The reflective surface offered an odd comfort, allowing me to keep an eye on the room without openly looking around. For a few blessed moments, I felt at ease, throwing myself into my routine. Then I saw him in the mirror. His face was partially obscured by the intricate framework of a chest press machine. He was crouching behind it, peering at me through a narrow gap in the equipment. My heart stumbled over itself as panic surged through me. The realization that he had followed me, no, hunted me, into this secluded corner, was a chilling one. When our eyes met in the mirror, he ducked out of sight, disappearing behind the machine. I froze, unsure of what to do. Confrontation wasn't in my nature. Fear held my voice hostage. Instead, I dropped the weights and made my way back to the front desk. The receptionist, a young woman who looked about as tired as I felt, listened with raised eyebrows as I explained the situation. Together, we cautiously returned to the area where I'd last seen him. The space was deserted. Machines stood empty. Mirrors reflected only us, and the oppressive silence returned. "Maybe he left," she offered uncertainly. I nodded, though the knots in my stomach told a different story. I apologized for troubling her and returned to my workout, though my focus was shattered. After a mere 15 minutes, I decided enough was enough. As I left, I waved goodbye to the receptionist, feeling a pang of guilt for leaving her alone. The parking lot was even quieter than when Ig arrived. My car sat under a lone streetlight, its metallic surface gleaming faintly in the pale glow. The night air was colder now, prickling against my skin as I walked briskly to my vehicle. Keys in hand, I reached for the door lock when a sound made me freeze. Footsteps, rapid, frantic footsteps echoed off the concrete, growing louder with each passing second. Turning, I saw a figure sprinting toward me from the shadows. My pulse thundered in my ears as I recognized the beanie and hoodie. It was him. Adrenaline surged, and I fumbled with my keys, yanking the car door open and throwing myself inside. The lock clicked into place a heartbeat before he reached the vehicle. He grabbed the handle, yanking at it violently, his face contorted with fury. The windows rattled as he kicked the door. His boots leaving dents in the metal panic spurred me into action. I jammed the key into the ignition and threw the car into reverse, tires screeching as I sped backward out of the parking space. The men stumbled out of the way, shouting something I could make out. I did stop to listen. Slamming the car into drive, I sped out of the lot, my heart pounding like a war drum. When I finally reached the safety of my home, I sat in the driveway, trembling. My car bore the scars of the encounter, dents and scuffs from his assault. Though I was unharmed. Guilt gnawed at me for not calling the police or warning the receptionist about the man. She was alone now, vulnerable, and I'd left her behind. I've battled night terrors for as long as I can remember, my nights haunted by vivid, bone-chilling dreams. Sleep disorders have been a part of my life, a shadowy companion to every setting sun. Sleep paralysis. It an unwelcome guest that shows up far too often, gripping me in a state of helplessness, blurring the line between reality and nightmare. More times than I can count, I've woken up to the sight of spiders, impossibly large, their hairy legs stretching across my bed, their glinting eyes fixed on me. For a fleeting moment, they seem real. So real that I scream, leap from my bed, and hurl pillows at these phantom invaders. But, like wisps of smoke, they vanish as my mind claws its way back to reality. The sheer vividness of these hallucinations leaves me rattled, my heart hammering long after the visions are gone. Nightmares, too, are constant companions. They twist my dreams into chaotic mazes of fear and confusion. Yet, nothing prepared me for what happened during one particularly stressful week. I had been drowning in schoolwork, the weight of assignments piling higher with each passing day. By Thursday night, I was a mess of frayed nerves and exhaustion, my mind and body teetering on the brink of collapse. With half a dozen assignments due Friday, I stayed up until the early hours of the morning. It must have been around 3 a.m. when I finally finished. My eyelids felt like lead, and I all but collapsed onto my bed, too drained to do anything but surrender to sleep. That night, my dreams took a dark and bizarre turn. I found myself in an endless, linear building. Its walls were stark and colorless, stretching far into the horizon, without an end in sight. Room after room, I moved with a singular, desperate purpose. Escape. Each room seemed to mock me, with scattered candies laid out like it was some twisted Halloween attraction. But the candy was a reward. It felt like a lure, a taunt. Behind me, I could hear it. Laughter, a childhood laughter, high-pitched and unnervingly cheerful. Yet it carried an edge that sent shivers racing down my spine. The sound seemed to come from everywhere, echoing through the halls, always just behind me. No matter how fast I ran, the laughter stayed close, as if it were part of the very air I breathed. Finally, I reached the end. A door loomed ahead, massive and foreboding. The laughter was deafening now, as though a dozen children were cackling just beyond the threshold. With trembling hands, I pushed the door open, and the dream shattered. I woke up. But something was wrong. I could move. The all-too-familiar weight of sleep paralysis held me captive. My body was locked in place, my limbs unresponsive, as if invisible chains anchored me to my bed. My chest tightened, every breath a struggle. The room was still, yet a sense of wrongness permeated the air. And then I heard it, the laughter. It came from the center of the room, chilling and unmistakable. My eyes darted to where the sound emanated, and I saw them. 4 figures stood there, holding hands. They formed a tableau of twisted normalcy. A tall man and woman, flanked by 2 small children. A perfect, distorted family. Their faces were the stuff of nightmares. Each one wore a smile, but not the kind that brings comfort. These were impossibly wide grins, stretching unnaturally across their faces, exposing teeth that gleamed too brightly in the dim light. Their eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, as though they could see straight through to my soul. My chest felt like it was about to cave in, the pressure mounting with every second. The figures began to move, not walking, but gliding closer, their feet never touching the floor. Their grins grew wider, their laughter louder, surrounding me, suffocating me. The air seemed to grow thicker, and I was sure I would be crushed under its weight. And then, something broke. My body snapped out of its paralysis, and I reacted instinctively. With a scream, I flung the sheets off me and hurled my pillows toward the figures. But the pillows struck nothing. The figures were gone. The room was silent, save for my ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart. I sat there, drenched in sweat, my hands trembling. I had experienced sleep paralysis countless times before, but this was something else entirely. The vividness, the sheer terror, it lingered long after the shadows in the room settled back into their rightful places. The next day, I scheduled an appointment with my doctor. As I recounted the events, they listened with concern, eventually prescribing new medication to help me manage my sleep disturbances. I used to work nights at a 24-hour fitness center in New Jersey. It wasn't exactly the most glamorous job, but it had its perks. The late hours meant the gym was usually empty, sparing me the monotony of checking in guests or cleaning up after them. On the flip side, those hours could be painfully dull, with the silence of the night pressing in as I sat behind the front desk. You might think a lot of strange things could happen during the graveyard shift at a gym, or maybe you wouldn't just a gym after all. But I can tell you this, in the years I worked there, only one incident left a mark on me, night that still sends shivers down my spine when I think about it. It started like any other quiet shift. I was sitting at the front desk, flipping through a magazine to pass the time. Every now and then, I glanced up out of sheer boredom, just to do some casual people watching. Well, in this case, person watching might be more accurate, as there was only one guy in the gym. He wasn't working out, though he was just pacing slowly. His movements were oddly deliberate, his gaze shifting around the room like he was searching for something, or someone. I watched as he moved toward the back section of the gym, disappearing behind the wall that divided the front area from the rear. With nothing else to occupy my attention, I went back to my magazine. About 10 minutes later, the gym was plunged into complete darkness. The lights went out, the music stopped, and an eerie silence enveloped the space. The suddenness of it froze me for a moment. It was so dark that I could see 2 feet in front of me. Thank goodness for smonks with built-in flashlights. I quickly turned mine on the narrow beam slicing through the oppressive blackness. I remembered. There was a power box in the storage room near the back of the gym. It was a logical place to start, but I couldn't shake the unsettling thought of the man pacing in the back section. Gripping my phone tightly, I began walking, calling out as I went. "Hello, sir. Are you still here?" My voice echoed faintly in the cavernous gym, but no reply came. The journey to the storage room felt like an eternity. Every creak of the floor beneath my feet, every shadow cast by my flashlight, seemed to grow louder and more menacing in the silence. When I finally reached the power box, I began flipping switches, trying every combination to bring the lights back. Nothing worked. The darkness remained unbroken, with no other options. I decided to close up for the night and wait for Kathy, the gym owner, to address the issue in the morning. But first, I needed to find that man. I could just lock him in. I searched every corner of the back section, shining my flashlight behind machines, into janitorial closets, and anywhere else someone might hide. Nothing. The only place left was the women's restroom. Reluctantly, I opened the door and called out again. "Hello, are you in here?" My voice bounced off the tiles, sounding much braver than I felt. Silence answered me, but I was not about to leave without checking thoroughly. I shone the flashlight in every direction, the stark beam illuminating sink counters, empty stalls, and tiled walls. Then I heard it, breathing. It was low and ragged, like someone struggling to draw air through clenched teeth. The sound came from one of the stalls. My hand trembled as I reached for the stall door, hesitating just long enough for dread to coil around me. "Are you in there?" I called again, trying to steady my voice. No response. Summoning every ounce of courage, I knelt to look under the stall door with my flashlight. 2 legs stood there motionless, mere inches from my face. The sight sent a jolt of terror through me. I stumbled to my feet, heart pounding, and bolted from the restroom. At the front desk, I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed Kathy. Of course, it went straight to voicemail. I left 2 frantic messages before realizing there was only one thing left to do: call the police. I reported a suspicious man in the gym and mentioned the power outage, keeping the details vague because, frankly, I wasn't sure what I'd just encountered. The dispatcher assured me an officer would be there shortly. The waiting was agony. The darkness and silence pressed in on me, amplifying every creak and distant sound. Then, out of nowhere, I heard it. A metallic clang from somewhere deep in the gym. It sounded like one of the machines, as if someone had dropped a weight. I shone my flashlight in the direction of the noise, calling out again. I caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow slipping between machines, just beyond the reach of my light. My breath caught as I aimed the beam toward it, my pulse racing. For a split second, I thought I saw a face staring back at me from the edge of the light, pale and distorted, before it vanished into the dark. The flashing red and blue lights of the police car outside felt like salvation. I rushed to the front door, unlocking it to let the officer in. He greeted me with a calm professionalism that felt almost out of place in the eerie atmosphere. Flashlight in hand, he did a thorough sweep of the gym, checking every corner, every closet, and finally, the restroom. When he returned, he shook his head. "There ain't no one here," he said. "Whoever it was must slipped out through the back door. You should lock up and come back in the morning." I followed his advice, though the walk to my car felt like a gauntlet. Sleep was impossible that night, my mind racing with what I'd seen, or thought I'd seen. When I returned to the gym the next morning, Kathy was already there. She'd fixed the power and was reviewing the security footage. Together, we scanned the recordings from the night before, searching for the man I'd described. But there was nothing. No footage of anyone entering the gym. No footage of anyone pacing the back section. It was as if he had never existed. Kathy looked at me with a mix of skepticism and concern. but I was too stunned to care. The first time I saw them, I was just a kid. It was one of those endless summer afternoons spent with my older cousins, the kind where time stretched like the golden rays filtering through the pines. We were gathering bear grass near the edge of the forest, where the trees grew tall and shadows danced playfully. I remember the smell of the earth, damp and alive, mingling with the crisp scent of the grass we plucked. Then I saw them about 60 yards from where we worked. They stood, tall, solitary, and utterly out of place. My heart skipped a beat as my curiosity took hold. Without a second thought, I wandered toward them, drawn by their silent invitation. As I approached, they revealed their peculiar details. They were made of wood, polished to a sheen, so pristine it seemed unnatural. Not a speck of dust or a stray leaf marred their surface, as if the forest itself had conspired to keep them immaculate. When I was about 20 feet away, something shifted. The vibrant hum of the forest stilled. No rustling leaves, no chirping birds, no distant chatter from my cousins. Even the air felt heavier, as though some invisible force pressed against my chest. The sunlight that had bathed the clearing moments ago dimmed, muted to a cold gray, as if the day had grown weary. I turned my head back toward my family, though they stood a mere 60 yards away. They looked impossibly distant, as though a vast chasm had opened between us. That was when the fear struck, raw and primal. It wasn't just fear of the unknown. It was a visceral terror that gripped me, whispering that whatever those stairs were, they did not belong. My legs moved before my mind could catch up, and I sprinted back, tears streaming down my face, and my breath coming in ragged gasps. My cousins shouted after me, their voices muffled as though filtered through water. I stumbled into my uncle, sobbing and pointing toward the place where the stairs had stood. But when we turned to look, they were gone. My uncle's face darkened. His usual jovial demeanor was replaced by a gravity I had never seen before. He crouched down to my level, gripping my shoulders firmly. "Never go near them again," he said, his voice low but urgent. I tried to protest, to explain, but he cut me off with a glance. "You don't know what you've stumbled on. Those stairs." He trailed off, his eyes scanning the forest as though searching for something unseen. Finally he spoke, his words etched into my memory. "I not meant for us. Some say they're doors to the spirit world, places where the veil is thin. People who climb them." He paused again, swallowing hard. "They don't that always come back, and if they do, they not the same. I did sleep that night. Every creak of the house, every rustle of wind outside, sent shivers through me. My uncle a warning echoed in my mind, mingling with the image of those impossibly clean steps. Years passed, but the memory of those stairs never faded. I would see them again, though never the same set twice. Sometimes they were small, barely more than a ladder leaning against the air. Other times they were grand, stone platforms that looked like remnants of some forgotten civilization. Each time they exuded that same eerie perfection. I learned to recognize the signs, the sudden hush of the forest, the dimming light, the way the air grew thick with something unspoken. And each time I did as my uncle taught me. I placed down a small offering, knee sprig of sage, a handful of tobacco, and prayed for protection. Then I turned and walked away, never looking back. The stories I've heard since then only deepened the mystery. Some who've encountered the stairs speak of fleeting visions, faces in the woods, strange lights, whispers that seem to come from nowhere. Others tell of people who climbed only to vanish entirely, leaving behind nothing but an unsettling stillness. I've often wondered why they appear, what purpose they serve, and who or what placed them there. Are they relics of some ancient ritual, traps set by forces beyond our understanding? Or perhaps they something else entirely, something that defies explanation. Even now, decades later, I can shake the unease they bring. They are a reminder that the world is larger and stranger than we can comprehend, filled with corners where logic holds no sway. The stairs in the woods are one such corner, and though I've resisted their pull, a part of me will always wonder what lies at the top. It was a cold winter evening during the break, and the house was shrouded in an unsettling silence. I was home alone, tucked away in our sunroom, a cozy but secluded space we used as a television and movie room. The room had large windows with blinds tightly drawn, and a door led out to the driveway. Snuggled under a blanket, I was watching a forgettable movie, enjoying the solitude, when the outside motion light suddenly flickered on. The unexpected burst of brightness startled me. My heart skipped a beat. The light was designed to turn on when something, or someone, moved in the driveway. I paused the movie and muted the volume, straining to catch any sound from outside. The walls felt thin, and the quiet of the room amplified my anxiety. I hesitated, then peeked through the blinds, holding my breath. The driveway was empty. Convincing myself it was probably a raccoon or some other nocturnal creature, I put on my shoes and stepped outside to investigate. The freezing air bit at my skin as I scanned the area. No sign of anyone. Or anything. With my nerves slightly eased, I returned to the couch, dismissing the incident as nothing more than an overactive imagination fooled by isolation. Minutes ticked by, and then came the noise. A sharp crash shattered the stillness, followed by the light snapping on again. My blood ran cold. This time, the sound was unmistakable. Something had tipped over a bucket outside. Panic tightened its grip on me. If it were an animal, it would bolt it after making such a racket. But what if it would? Frozen with fear, I stayed on the couch. My position provided the only blind spot from the door to the driveway, and I was too terrified to move. My eyes darted to the remote on the coffee table, but I couldn't even summon the courage to reach for it. The television's faint glow felt like a betrayal, as if it announced my presence to anyone, or anything, lurking outside. Then I saw it throw the blinds. I caught the outline of a figure. It was unmistakable. Human shape, arms slightly outstretched, motionless. My chest tightened, and my breaths grew shallow. Every fiber of my being screamed to run, but my legs refused to move. The figure stood there, silent and menacing, bemoaning every ounce of courage. I crept toward the doorway leading back into the house, hoping to put a barrier between myself and the intruder. Before I could reach it, a violent knocking shattered the silence. The sound was deafening in the quiet room. I froze in place, paralyzed with fear. The pounding continued, aggressive and unrelenting. "I'm calling the police," I yelled, my voice trembling. The knocking stopped abruptly. For a moment, the only sound was my ragged breathing. Then, I saw the shadow move toward the door. As it neared, I caught a glimpse of her, older woman, with wiry, unkempt hair, her face contorted in an expression I could quite place. She looked unhinged, her eyes wild and searching. For a fleeting moment, her frail appearance made her seem less intimidating, but that illusion shattered when she began banging on the glass with both hands, screaming incomprehensibly. Panic took over. I slammed the door to the sunroom and grabbed my phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. The operator's calm voice was a lifeline as I described the situation, my words coming out in a jumbled rush. She instructed me to lock myself in a room and stay on the line until help arrived. I retreated to the bathroom, locking the door behind me. My hands shook as I gripped a small metal rod Adu found under the sink. The operator reassured me help was on the way, but time stretched unbearably. Suddenly, The sound of shattering glass echoed through the house. She was inside. Tears streamed down my face as I listened to her footsteps. The house felt like it was shrinking, her presence suffocating. She mumbled incoherently, her words low and guttural. My heart pounded as I peered through the bathroom. Door a tiny crack. There she was, standing in the middle of the living room amidst shards of broken glass, her wiry hair catching the dim light. She turned toward me, her eyes locking onto mine. In a blind panic, I slammed the door shut and locked it again. Her footsteps grew louder, her voice more frantic. She began pounding on the bathroom door, her fists relentless. "Go away!" I screamed, my voice breaking. But she didn't stop. The sound of knocking at the front door interrupted the nightmare. My heart leapt with hope. I opened the bathroom window and screamed for help. 2 police officers appeared, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. "She ain't inside," I cried, pointing toward the broken window. The officers acted swiftly. I heard their commanding voices ordering the woman to step away from the door. The banging ceased, followed by a chaotic scuffle. When I finally mustered the courage to leave the bathroom, I saw the officers had subdued her. The woman's wild eyes bore into me as they escorted her out. She mumbled something unintelligible, her expression a mix of rage and confusion. I looked away, unable to bear the sight. Later, I learned she was a mentally ill woman who lived nearby with a caretaker who rarely let her out of the house. My parents pressed charges against the caretaker for negligence, but the case didn't go in their favor. The woman was placed in a treatment center, far from our neighborhood, and though I should felt relieved, the memory of her eyes haunted me. I have always been drawn to the forest. As a child growing up in El Salvador, the wilderness was my sanctuary. My school, the prestigious Panama School, was nestled deep within the forested slopes of the San Salvador volcano. For a 10-year-old, it felt like a vast and magical kingdom. I spent countless hours hiking through what we called our private forest, the dense canopy providing a green cathedral under which my imagination roamed freely. Weekends with my parents were an extension of this love for the wild. We often visited the cafes and coffee farms scattered across the country, each one surrounded by lush jungles teeming with life. I would venture into the dense undergrowth, the cries of birds and the rustle of leaves, my only companions. I never felt fear. The forest in all its untamed beauty was my friend. That changed when I moved to Spain. I now live near Barcelona, in a small town perched on the hillside of one of the mountains that fringed the city. For 3 years, the well-maintained trails that wind through the local hills have been my escape. My dog, an Alaskan Malamute named Coda, accompanies me on these hikes. Coda's boundless energy and playful spirit make him the perfect partner for exploring the mountains. For the longest time, our weekend treks were uneventful. The trails were safe, the scenery serene, but everything changed a few weeks ago. Under the power lines that stretch across the mountain, a strip of forest had been cleared. It was a precautionary measure against fires, say necessary if somewhat jarring alteration to the landscape. The newly exposed trail was a straight, open path, a rare feature in this otherwise winding terrain. I decided to explore it with Coda, relishing the thought of letting him roam freely without worrying about hidden dangers. We set off on a bright afternoon, the sky a flawless expanse of blue. At first, everything felt normal. The trail was quiet, the air crisp, but as we progressed, an unsettling sensation began to creep over me. It started subtly, a tingling at the back of my neck, a faint unease that I tried to dismiss as fatigue or the oddity of the unfamiliar path. Coda, usually exuberant and carefree, began acting strangely. He stayed close to my side, his usual bursts of energy replaced by a cautious gait. He sniffed the air repeatedly, his ears swiveling like satellite dishes. The cheerful chatter of birds and the hum of insects had vanished, leaving an oppressive silence in their wake. It wasn't just quiet, it was an absence, a void that seemed to swallow all sound. As we approached the end of the trail, the unease grew stronger. At the base of a tall metal power pole, I paused. The surrounding forest loomed, its shadows darker and deeper than they should have been under the bright sun. Koda stopped a few steps ahead, his body tense. He stared intently at the woods beyond the pole, his tail low and his posture rigid. Then he began to back away, inching closer to me. At first I thought he wanted to play, but his soft whimpering told a different story. It wasn't a sound of pain or need. It was a quiet plea, an instinctual response to something he could understand but knew was wrong. The silence pressed against us, so heavy it felt tangible. Not even the faint hum of electricity from the power lines broke the stillness. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a deafening drum in the void. Suddenly, Koda barked a single, sharp sound that cut through the silence like a knife. For an Alaskan Malamute, a breed known more for howling than barking, this was unusual. His bark wasn't playful or demanding. It was a warning. A wave of dread washed over me. The sensation was visceral, primal. I felt exposed, unwelcome, as if unseen eyes were boring into my soul. My skin prickled, and every instinct screamed at me to leave. The forest, which had always been my refuge, now felt hostile. Koda's stance confirmed my fears. He had retreated behind me, his body trembling but his gaze fixed on the woods. His normally cheerful demeanor was replaced by a seriousness I'd never seen before. He growled softly, a low rumble that sent shivers down my spine. Whatever was out there, it wasn't something he recognized or trusted. I wanted to move, to run, but my legs felt like lead. The air itself seemed to thicken, each breath a struggle. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to take a step back, then another. Koda followed, never turning his back on the trees. His growls grew louder, more insistent. The forest's oppressive silence seemed to mock our retreat. Finally, my paralysis broke. Grabbing Koda's leash, I turned and sprinted back the way we came. The world blurred as adrenaline took over. My only thought was to put as much distance as possible between us and whatever lay beyond the power pole. Koda matched my pace, his powerful legs propelling him forward, but his occasional glances over his shoulder told me he had not let his guard down. When we reached the main trail, the oppressive feeling lifted as abruptly as it had descended. The familiar sounds of the forest returned. The rustle of leaves, the chirping of birds, the distant hum of life. But the memory of that silence, that suffocating void, lingered. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the experience over and over in my mind. What had I felt? What had Koda sensed? I couldn't explain it. The forest, so vibrant and alive, had turned into something alien, something other. For the first time in my life, the woods felt like a place I didn't belong. Even now, weeks later, I haven't returned to that trail. The thought of the power pole and the dark woods beyond it fills me with unease. I still hike with Koda, but I stick to familiar paths, ones where the sunlight filters through the trees and the sounds of the forest remind me that I'm not alone. I own a modest house nestled on a sprawling piece of land in the rural backwoods of New York. It's a quiet retreat I visit several times a year, especially during the winter months for skiing. The property is surrounded by dense woods, their skeletal branches arching over the snow like ghostly fingers. To one side, a tall fence separates my property from a neighbor I've never spoken to. On the other side, the forest stretches endlessly, an untamed wilderness. Another neighbor lives further down the road across the street, someone I've met a few times. Our shared love of skiing gave us a reason to chat now and then. This past January marked my first trip up for the season. As I approached the house, the crunch of snow underfoot was interrupted by a sound that made me pause. The faint, tinkling laughter of a child drifting from the direction of my neighbor property. Strange, I didn't know they had kids. The sound faded as quickly as it came, leaving only the eerie quiet of winter in its wake. Stepping into the house after months away always felt unsettling. The air inside was stale, and the silence oppressive. Like the house itself resented my absence. I busied myself turning on the water and heat, letting the hum of life return to the building. Exhausted from the 4-hour drive from Connecticut, I collapsed into bed and slept deeply, unbothered by the unfamiliar creaks and groans of a house settling back into its rhythm. The next morning, after breakfast, and gearing up for a day of skiing, I stepped outside and was greeted by something peculiar, a bright red ball resting in the snow on my front lawn. It had been there the day before. Assuming it belonged to the neighbors, I tossed it over the fence before heading to the ski lodge. The day was uneventful, filled with the camaraderie of friends and the rush of skiing, but when I returned that evening, the ball was back. It sat in the same spot, its vibrant hue stark against the white snow. Unease prickled at the back of my neck as I picked it up and threw it over the fence again. It felt heavier this time, like it carried something unseen. Shrugging it off, I went inside, eager to end the day. That night, I was jolted awake by the sound of laughter. It was faint but unmistakable. A child giggle carried on the icy wind. The clock read 2:17 a.m. My pulse quickened as I peered out the window, but the yard was empty. The laughter ceased as if it had never been, but there in the snow was the red ball again. This time I did not throw it back. I stepped into the freezing night air, my slippers sinking into the snow, and carried the ball inside. It felt unnaturally warm, as though it had been cradled in someone's hands. I set it on the living room floor and returned to bed, trying to dismiss the gnawing anxiety building in my chest. The night passed in restless silence. The following morning, I decided to confront my neighbor. Surely they had children, and surely this was all just a harmless game. But when the door opened, I was greeted by an elderly man, his eyes soft with curiosity. After introducing myself, I hesitantly asked about the laughter and the ball. He gave me a puzzled look and assured me that no children lived nearby. His words were like a bucket of ice water poured over my already frayed nerves. I thanked him and retreated to the solitude of my home. I left the ball in the living room that day as I went skiing, trying to convince myself it was nothing more than a strange coincidence. When I returned that night, drained and aching, I barely had the energy to eat before collapsing into bed. But sleep didn't come easy. I woke to that same laughter, louder this time, more insistent. My heart pounded as I threw back the covers and rushed to the window. There it was again, the red ball in the snow. Frantic, I tore through the living room, searching for the ball I'd left there. It was gone. My breath came in short, panic gasps. I locked every door and window, turned on every light, and packed my belongings in a mad rush. As I glanced out the window one last time, my heart nearly stopped. Beyond the ball, a figure stood, a child, motionless. Their face was obscured, their body unnaturally stiff as they stared at my house. I dropped to the floor, trembling, and crawled to shut the blinds. My hands shook as I moved from window to window, closing myself off from the outside world. But even behind the blinds, I could feel the weight of that gaze. Sleep eventually claimed me, though it was restless and shallow by morning. I had made up my mind. I skipped breakfast, threw my belongings into the car, and sped away from that house without a backward glance. As I drove down the icy road, the red ball lingered in my mind, an unshakable image. To this day, I can explain what happened. How did the ball leave my house? Who or what Was that child standing in the snow? The laughter still echoes in my dreams, a haunting melody that refuses to fade. I've stayed away from the house ever since, unwilling to face whatever waits in the shadows of that rural property.